All right, recording. And this, I've moved to recording in the cloud instead of on my computer so that it can make transcripts, and some of the other new features of Zoom are available from that. But can make some of those available to people. Anyway, we're starting this time on a whole new book. This is Contributions to Philosophy at the Event, unpublished work from the period 36 to 38 for the most part. Who knows if some of them were a little bit before that. But one of the more challenging things from Heidegger, because it's not like his public lectures, therefore it's not pitched at the level of what he is making sure the students can follow. It's also not exposition of a particular thinker from the tradition. It's his own views on things. So for both those reasons, it's more challenging. It's kind of written for himself as he's working things out, or for a more advanced student who's following his own train of reasoning, to the extent there are such. We haven't all had access to it, especially in translation, until more recently. So there isn't just the same sort of depth of scholarship there is on it. Certainly compared to something like Being in Time, which was famous in his lifetime, etc. Anyway, for all those reasons, it's more challenging. The subject matter is more challenging. The subtitle of the event is about this Ereignis idea, which is sort of a core thing in late Heidegger, distinguishing from early Heidegger. So anyway, that's just background of what the book is. We're going to try to start off doing it relatively slow, with we only did about 50 pages this time. I do want people's comment or input on whether or not that pace is too fast or too slow. After the next time, we're going to keep going at about this pace. We're going to do just the rest of part one for our next session. I want to know from people, could we speed up? Must we slow down? Anything like that. In terms of more administration stuff, I'm planning on our next session to be on January the 14th. That gives us like an extra week because some people will have some time off for the holidays. I don't want to do the 7th because it's too soon after things coming back. So that's 5 weeks from now. And the reading is just going to be the balance of part one. So that only takes us to page 85. So it's actually a somewhat shorter reading than this time. Okay, so that's just administrative backgrounds on what we're reading, and what we're going to read for next time, and when we're going to have the next session. With that, we can start with our round robin of first impressions. And Joe, you want to start us off on record this time?
Well, I found it very challenging. I can appreciate that he's sort of writing this down, I suppose, in his home study or something. Just as he's thinking up an idea and wants to write about it and work it through for a while. I'm sort of hoping that we tackle a single section at a time in a discussion, even though that might only be 10 minutes, so that we can sort of follow why he did that and why it's organized here as number 21 or number 37 or whatever the numbering system is. But the point is that I don't find any flow of continuity that I found in the other works, because I can see that he's putting these together, or they are being put down almost as notes. And then I'm reminded that's sort of how Nietzsche worked also, and that he didn't have the people that came after him tried to figure out how should we put these together as coherent chapters or something. And anyway, I'm just puzzled about that. But the thoughts that he was bringing out were very, attractive. They worth thinking about, as he said in his earlier book, calling me to think about the idea. But I can't say that he got me there. So I'm very eager to hear your further discussion and going over it, and then of course reading watching the recording, because I find I get much from our meetings by being there the second and the third time with the help of YouTube.
Yep. Okay. Fair. We'll go through at least some of the things in that level of section by section detail. Probably not every section, but I'm going to focus when we get to exposition, especially on the sort of outline of the structure of the whole book in section 3, where he lays out this, resonating interplay, leap, grounding, future ones, the last God, which is the section names, if you haven't looked ahead, of the remaining sections of the book, right? Except for the last one, being, which is kind of a summing up or synthesizing all that. But the point is that there is a kind of structure that he's going to lay out here and try to sketch through. Each one of them brings up its own things, In this one, because it's the introduction, it's kind of synoptic, so it's got some top level things about what that overall structure is, what kind of its motives are. So there's some more foundational things here, if I can put it that way. But in the nature of the case, there's that in every section as you get deeper into it. But by the time we're in the middle of the book, there'll be some of these things which are exposition of a structure that, you know, it's not clear anyone but he has ever thought of, right? So you're in the realm of trying to follow his almost private thoughts. So if it's your first experience of them, yes, this can be challenging. We'll try to at least explain why those sections fit together. The sort of full way in which they all knit together is only something you appreciate at the end of the whole book, if you appreciate it, or if they do fit together. But the basic sketch of why there would be these moments in the overall undertaking here, we can give a word for that overall undertaking here as a new beginning, or the new beginning, or, you know, some refounding of Western thought back at the same level of what happened in the Greeks, something like that. And that may have a title of Regnus or of the event, but let's just, for now, just call it the new beginning, whatever that means. And some things which follow just as in the structure of what does it mean for there to be a new beginning in philosophy at all. And we'll see that a fair amount of the structure that he's laying out there is almost necessary from that alone. If there is a new beginning in philosophy, if it's possible for a new beginning in philosophy, it has to look something like this, is sort of the underlying thought. But we'll get to all that in the actual exposition. But I do appreciate that even if you have some familiarity with the rest of Heidegger, this can seem quite alien. It also helps to know sort of a basic problem he's reacting to, though, which is we saw that stuff in his works on Nietzsche, in the Word of Nietzsche essay we read together. There's a basic reaction to something like a modern nihilism or a modern technological worldview, something like that, that is at play or at stake here. There's something like an impasse at an end of metaphysics that he thinks of as a historical problem that needs to be wrestled with. And that's the basic environing occasion for these reflections. So in a way, that's taking over Nietzsche's problem, but rejecting Nietzsche's solution to the problem, if that makes some sense. Anyway, that's just background to get a little bit of orientation. First reactions from Pete.
I had read the previous translation in the 90s. I had the book, I dipped into it, but I hadn't read it straight through. So this is the first time I've read page 5 through 50 straight through, and it confirms my sense that this is a much better translation than the previous one. So reading it, there's stuff I recognize from other parts of Heidegger. He's always working with the question of being. He has the same basic paradigm, but some of the vocabulary changes. There's some bits that are, I don't, quite understand, like the absconding last god. I'm still trying to fit that into the rest of Heidegger. Things to remark. One is the nationalism, which I guess kind of peaked 2 years earlier in 34. He did a seminar on Hegel, where he's thinking about nation and state and how they fit in with history. And in 35, an introduction to metaphysics, he's also concerned about the German people, and that's still going on here. And I think it partly shows up in this new Dasein with a hyphen. So we're familiar with Dasein from Being in Time, which is about mindness and me being thrown into a world, whereas now the Dasein is grounded in history, and of course, so we knew it was contingent from being in time. Everybody is thrown into their time and location, but now we're thrown into a world which is contingent on nation and language and the people. And so there's more of that here than before, and more than we found in what is called thinking, which I guess was 53 or so. So we're just past peak Heidegger nationalism in this text. Another thing I noticed was machinations, which I don't think came up before, but it's kind of or the beginning of the Gestalt understanding of being in modern times. Some of that stuff is in what he has to say about machination.
It's worth pointing out there, if I may, just jump for a second. Machination, as machination, machine-like things, is also evoking technology, but it's also connecting that evocation of technology with the German Macht, right? The will to power, the power in Nietzsche's will to power is the same Macht in machinations, and the machinations is also referring to technology. So if you're knitting together Nietzsche and technology, then machination is kind of the joining word for what is in common between the power thinking of late Nietzsche and the technological world of the essence concerning question concerning technology.
Yeah, and so we know this is from 36 to 38, and we're not quite sure what order he wrote the different sections in. But I think it's in 36 when he's doing the Nietzsche lectures on will to power. And I think in 37 he does the next one on the eternal recurrence. And so it makes sense that will to power would be foremost in his mind around here in his private notebooks.
I think it's fair to say that there's a general agon struggle with Nietzsche going on here, of Nietzsche as the last great philosophy of the West, Nietzsche as the metaphysician who ends metaphysics, Nietzsche as the philosopher who has taught Heidegger himself much about the problem, but also as a consummation of modern subjectivity that is ending in an impasse, that is something to be gotten out of, that is ending in a nihilism of its own kind. And he's seeing that not just in Nietzsche, but in the modern world around him, and in the ideology of the regime, and in totalizing ideologies generally, and power thinking generally. And that does engage with some of the stuff you were talking about, the nationalism stuff, but also some of the discussion of ideology here and worldviews here, which we'll get to. But there's definitely, in this whole period, he's in the midst of a strife with Nietzsche, if I can put it that way, about wrestling with what he rejects and accepts from Nietzsche, and what all that means. But we'll get to that in the exposition, but you're absolutely right to raise those as themes to pay attention to.
Yeah, so I guess that's enough about first impressions. A quick question: did you say January 14th?
I was thinking January 14th. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'll be flying back from a Heidegger seminar at Cal State. Hopefully that'll fly back in the morning, and I'll be there for that. But I'm kind of, I just got confirmed that I could do it.
Gotcha.
Have some other stuff going
well,
on in the area.
Do let me know. There is potentially some flexibility for 7th or 21st. I would try to avoid the 7th just because of other events I have on that weekend, but 14th is better for me. But if it turns out to be a hard no for several people, I might be able to move it a week. But let me know how your availability looks for the 14th.
Sure, and yeah, and then you were asking about length of time, and I think the 7th might be too short. I don't know, maybe just about, if we're doing another 50 pages.
Yeah, it's more like 35, but it's a comparable
Okay.
length. It's 35. I do expect that people aren't going to have quite as much time for it because of people having other things going on over the holidays. So I did want to give that extra week. I know I'll want the extra week. But okay, useful on the
Yeah,
availability.
so once I book my flights, I'll let you know.
All right, sounds great. First impressions, Dan?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I read this book, the same translation, about 3 years ago. So this is kind of rereading for me. And actually interesting, like during the last 6 months, I read a lot of the books, Heidegger's book from this period, and Hölderlin especially. I read, I think, 3 of the 4 ones, like the one with the Germania and the Rhine and elucidations and Easter. And I think it fits. It's, moving, Heidegger moving more like towards this kind of language and more poetic saying and stuff like that. And I see that. I appreciate contributions more now. And also I agree with Pete. I also read, like, actually a month ago, I read that Hegel seminar, and I like the nationalistic aspect of it. It's there, but it's not direct. It's vague, and but I think he's confronting that, and he's talking about it anyway. So as far as reading, so first, in terms of amount, in general for our meetings, I allocate 3-4 days, and that's enough. This time I barely did it in 2 weeks, so it's quite dense. Maybe I'm also like to spend more time on this, but it's dense, and I especially find dense the first 20 pages. It's like that prospectus is kind of, to me, it's a summary of everything. It reminded me, like, being in time. Introduction is not really an introduction; it's a summary of everything. So the first 20 pages were quite dense, and it goes directly into the matter, and then after that, it lightened a little bit. And I guess he approaches, like, he develops his project, and then he needs to I don't know, to clear different topics, like you mentioned, worldview. I think today just read about what was the consciousness and I and the self, and there is technology, and there is art, and there is he kind of stops, and he dwells for, like, he feels the need to contrast what he's doing with the typical, or what's the obstacle there for him. And I think it's very punctual, it's not very coherent, those points, but I think there are usually in half a page, he goes very deep into subtopic and very important topic and stuff like that. But I think those are my first impressions. And yeah.
So I agree with you that the first part, the synoptic part, can be quite challenging, especially if you don't know where he's going. I should say that this is basically my 3rd time reading this, and read it a couple of times for this. Read the whole book, and a couple of years ago, and so coming back to it before agreeing to do it this time, and then so this is like 3rd time through reading it with you guys. But that makes it a little bit easier to see some of the structure going on in the synoptic part, because I've seen the train before and I know how these things are, sketches of that. So I can help a little bit with that part. The first time through, it can seem bewildering. Where is this coming from? Where's it going to? I would then say that the next section is really about this this idea of fundamental mood. The idea that there's a fundamental mood involved in this switch, this change to an conceptual thinking or a new beginning. So he spends a lot of time on the motivating mood, if I can put it that way, and then next on the worldview question, and then on the conceptual thinking idea. And we haven't gotten through the rest of 1, but besides the sketch, I think there's a structure to those things. The fundamental mood is meant to be like an experiential grounding of why this is something he's undertaking at all. And the worldview stuff is a little bit like a contrast and a why it is needed and why philosophy has a calling to do something like this. And then the conceptual thinking is trying to explain what is distinctly new in the kind of thing he's trying to do here from philosophy as it was in the tradition, something like that. That's pretty much as we get here. We'll go through that more in the exposition, but there is it's not simply episodic that these things come up. They have a logic in what he's trying to do in part 1. But because the language is strange and the modes of thinking are strange, it's very easy to not see that underlying structure the first time through. But okay, helpful and also helpful on the pacing question. I do have some ambition of trying to speed up after we got through a couple of sessions, but just because of how much there is to do. But if it's not possible and we have to keep this pace, we'll just keep this pace as needed.
One more thing is the language. I was like, it's not technical at all. But it's very simple, but it's in a way is more complicated. It's more difficult to grasp what he's like reading Being in Time and some other. He gets technical. Not here. It's poetical and it's simple, but it's very primitive, and the words are giving primitive meanings, or it's secondary meanings and stuff like that.
It's a fair point, and he even thematizes that here, where he talks about some of the things that are different that way between the older systematic mathematical thinking, as he calls it, and the kind of thinking which is proper for conceptual thinking. When we get to conceptual thinking, we'll talk about that contrast. And it's fair to say that in Being in Time, there's a mix of those things, and it can make it easier to follow for a systematic thinker, so to speak, that it has the systematic aspects, especially for someone trained in neo-Kantianism or something like that. And the shift away from that here is deliberate, as we'll get to in the conceptual thinking section, but fair to notice that contrast. Christopher, do you want to tell us about, did you manage to do the reading? Have you read this stuff before, and first impressions?
Sure. This is my first reading of contributions. I just took a class on Being in Time over the summer, so I read that. And then I've read On the Essence of Truth, the Plato's Theaetetus.
Yep.
And then a couple other essays and stuff on Heidegger. I've read a bunch of works when I was in college, like maybe 10 years ago, like the Dreyfus Commentary, Bill Blattner's, and some others. But I would say this is the most cryptic, or like poetic, as Dan was saying. I agree with him, of Heidegger, where like Being in Time, once you sort of understand the language, it felt more approachable. So I'm hoping as we expand on it more, I'll kind of unlock his argument, because I watched a couple of YouTube videos on it, and there's an analytic philosophy professor kind of saying that he had to turn off his analytical brain and then see kind of the more continental, like circular argumentation going on. So I'm sure there's a reason to why Heidegger is writing the way he is. So I also read a book on contributions to philosophy, but I don't think it really helped. It was by the translator of this version, Daniela, and that was kind of helpful, but also I feel like confused me more just because it went into like later sections.
Got it. So it was because it was branching out into the whole book and parts you hadn't read yet. It was easy, even if she had a grasp of it, easy to get lost in what she was referring to that you hadn't seen yet.
But yeah.
Yeah, got it. No, that's fair. So that's first of all, welcome. You've got sound background for this. The Essence of Truth stuff is very helpful for this. You're going to have enough challenge to get through this part of it. If there's other background that might be useful, it might be the Word of Nietzsche essay that we did together. I don't know, about a year ago or something. You might look for those on the YouTube channel if you want, or read that essay yourself. Just as a suggestion for background on where we're starting from, or where he's starting from at this point. Which isn't to say that that essay immediately precedes this. It actually came later, but the struggle with the same issues is discussed there. But okay, that's very helpful. Any comments on the pace yet? Is this a pace that's doable for you?
Yeah, I like the pace. I would say too, the first like 20 or so pages as well, I was kind of getting the gist of it, but I felt like it was pretty readable once I got the rhythm of it going. So I'm good with like the 50 pages a week. I feel like if we start doing more than that, it may get too cumbersome.
Well, if we could do 50 pages a week, I'd be ecstatic, but 50 pages a month.
Oh yeah, month. I'm sorry.
yeah, no, that's fine. No, that's good to hear. All right, thanks. Welcome again. And James, you want to go next?
Sure, thanks. So I've read this before, and I guess I'll just say that this was a good opportunity to read it again. It's been a while. It's one of those works where you really can't become an expert in it. So It's always something you can find new stuff in on each reread. It's also one of those books where even among Heidegger's works, which are all kind of like this, but you could spend lots of time on a paragraph, just diving in deep to a single paragraph over several days, and etymology and connections with previous and future works. And so just taking the opportunity here with you all to go through it again. I've got some personal opinions on what might be going on here in different areas, but just to throw out some themes that I kind of like in this work would be a lot of what Pete said. Technology is huge, the confrontation with technology, machination certainly. And then if we keep the background of his interest in Nietzsche in this time in view, the connection then between sort of this broad idea of nihilism and how technology is sort of bringing that into realization in this time in Heidegger's view. Let's see what else. I think there's with the words, with the etymology of the different versions of sign and Dasein and such, I think there's some really interesting things going on there. Although I think, we have to be careful about how much we put into that, how much we read into the different versions of the words he's using. Yeah, so I'm excited about this, to follow along here with you all and hear everybody else's opinion and see what we come up with. And I might have some other opinions as we go along.
Sounds great. All right, thanks and welcome. Glad you've had a chance to read before and read again with us. All right, Jason, Jason B.
Yeah, I've read this essay before, and this time I want to go through it and try to understand what the event has to do with the clearing, because one is about time to some extent, and the other one's about space. And I've never really thought about comparing them before, but this time I think I can at least make an attempt. So this is a nice discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think they're both trying to be about this time-space idea, but yes, there are contrast those, and we'll start getting into those in the next section. And it does become more of a theme later in the book. But I think that it's also fair to say that in the New Beginning overall, Heidegger is laying out a different fundamental relationship between philosophy and time, between thinkers and time. What do I mean by that? This is part of why he's stressing event. Event is something which happens in time as an actuality once. So it is the farthest thing from an eternal pattern, often the Hyper-Uranian realm of the ideas, which is a universal instance over eternally supervening over multiple instances, right? The instances aren't multiple, it happens once. It happens, it's not outside time, and it's unique, not a pattern across a many, something like that. And that contrast is fundamental to what's going on here. So you can think of this in just pure German 19th century philosophy terms as, in the realm of history, we're dealing with unique occurrences, whereas in the realm of nature, we dealt with something like universal or abstract truths, right? The universal abstract truths that metaphysics in traditional sense wanted to focus on are not where Heidegger thinks the essential grounding of experience of being happens. He thinks it happens in the event, it happens in history, it has a history, it happens in time, right? So that's a different relation. And I say different relation, I don't mean that this is a structural change in how human being experiences time or how human being experiences truth. It's a change in the emphasis of what counts as philosophically important, right? The things which were accidental to an Aristotle are essential to someone who's focusing on the unique in time or the unique in history, and vice versa to a degree. So anyway, we'll get to that when we get to conceptual thinking, but the relationship of these things to space specifically may come out in another way, or time space as the term he uses here. But at bottom, we saw at the end of being, even at the end of being in time, that something about the experience of Dasein was grounded in man's experience of temporality, or the temporality of man's being. That's still here. That's vintage Heidegger, and that's part of this shift to a new beginning. But how deep that goes, how much that affects, is what is kind of in play here, if that makes sense. So what kinds of things have a history, as opposed to what kinds of things are eternal truths set forever? Are only the things which are eternal truths set forever fundamentally important? Heidegger is going to say no. Right? Some of the things that are fundamentally important their ontic status, or the ontological status is that they are events. They are occurrences in time once, including thoughts. We'll come to that when we come to conceptual thinking. But you brought up the time and the time space thing, and I think that focusing on the time part here it's the high road in, so to speak, is to notice those differences. If you want to know why Heidegger is not a Platonist, it's because he thinks about time in a way that is an inversion of how Platonists think about time, if that makes some sense. All right, but we need to pull back to exposition of what is basically happening here. So several people mentioned the cryptic nature, or the difficult conceptual nature. Several people mentioned the confrontation with technology, or Nietzsche, or nihilism. So what basically is going on here? There's a fundamental attitude or shift here that Heidegger is sketching out towards the actual limitations of the thing he's sketching out, this reaction to, we want to think about, but something like the modern world, right? The modern impassive nihilism, the modern world, modernity, where metaphysics ends us, Nietzscheanism, the early 20th century, technology, whatever. There's something that all those things in that bundle have together, to which Heidegger is reacting, and his reaction to all of them is not one of a hearty embrace, playing trombones and beating drums in favor of them, right? What is his attitude towards them? His attitude towards them is foreboding and restraint, as he puts it. Now, I want to just tie this up to some other thinkers. Weber talks about the disenchantment of the world as something that modernity and science has brought about. You see this in both the technologism and in secularism, lots of other things like that. There's a kind of visceral reaction to the disenchanted world as being a world devoid of meaning, something like that. We see in other things going on, which he refers to here as the philosophical confusion of the 19th century, giving rise to worldview philosophy, but also you find in people like Weber, who wants philosophy to abandon trying to judge values and retreat to being a technique that just advises people on how things can be done, or logical positivism that wants to reduce it to a matter of method, something like that, and method and logic that is meant to be independent of all value. There is an abandoning of the idea that philosophy, or something like philosophic thought, sets values. There is an evaporation of anything like spiritual thought or spiritual leadership as unbelievable. There is the death of God in Nietzsche, and the result that we're seeing values as human creations, and those human creations as themselves subordinate to some overarching historical process of a struggle for power, something like that. So reason was the lodestar of the modernity and the Enlightenment, with which it was crusading against the enchanted world. It succeeded in disenchanting the world, and then people became disenchanted with reason, and reason becomes completely instrumental. And what is determining the ends to which this instrumental reason is put? Something very close to the passions, something very close to subjective whim, or something very impersonal and historical and power drivey, if you put it that way, right? So it's not just a disenchantment of the world as something that Voltaire is in favor of. It's also some sort of unease or reaction at the end of it of standards seeming to have evaporated. something like that, especially standards that have any pretense to being spiritually or intellectually supported, right? Supported by something other than interest or a number of votes or something like that, but instead by some sort of thoughtfulness, rationality, spiritual depth, moral leadership, anything like that. That's what seems to be evaporating in something like nihilism. Call all that the disenchantment of the world, right? I put it to you, Heidegger is engaged in the project from that point of view of what would it take to re-enchant the world, right? And that doesn't mean go back to the way it was enchanted before. It means return to something, to some situation in which something like a spiritual or thought leadership would be a source of meaning and purpose in a way that might have seemed to be there in the earlier dispensations. Maybe it was only fakely there in the earlier dispensations. We can come to that. But there's an attitude of the disenchantment of the world, which is an attitude of unease. When he's explaining the difference between philosophy in the first beginning and his own time, what he's going at, he says in the first beginning, the experience of philosophy was wonder. Its basic experience was wonder. But in the new beginning, its basic experience is foreboding, he says. Foreboding about what? Something like there's something out of joint in the world when purpose is lost. There's something out of joint in the world when essential ends are no longer being set by thought. And that creates a sense of foreboding, both that there's something out of joint and that something is coming, and the something that is coming is not particularly good. Hence this sense of foreboding. And he's saying that sense of foreboding is a basic kind of instinctual, not even yet conscious mood reaction to the experience of nihilism in the modern world. The experience of machination, the experience of bustle, right, etc., and of strife of worldviews and apparent meaninglessness and apparent lack of highest standards. All of that gets an experience, creates a mood of the world is out of joint, something is off, something is missing. There's some analogies from Chesterton. Chesterton is talking once about he's contemplating the madman in the asylum who thinks that he is God, and he says, well, if he is a god, he's not much of a god, right? And then he compares this to the mechanical universe of the materialist and says, if it's a universe, it's not much of a universe. The thing has shrunk, right? So there seems to be something left out, something missing, something has been oversimplified away, and something essential has been lost. That basic attitude is there throughout, and Heidegger is insisting in the middle sections of our reading here that basic attitude is the first way in which we gain information about the very possibility of a new beginning. The possibility of a new beginning rests upon unease about where we are at the end of the old beginning. The old beginning led us through metaphysics to something like Nietzschean philosophy of will to power and something like a technological world in which reason is completely instrumental and impersonal power blocks clash with one another by claiming to be better at mobilizing resources for power, something like that. And in all of that, man is becoming mere raw material in the competition of these power blocks. And anything like a spiritual mission or an intellectual mission of mankind seems to have evaporated, and man is a mere raw material. And something in that seems off, something in that seems degrading, something in that seems a loss of a sense of man's mission or destiny, something like that. So that's a basic where we are that he's talking about in the mood sections of what's the fundamental mood behind a new beginning. First of all, any questions or reactions to anything I just said? Pete.
Yeah, so I just want to comment to follow on with what you've been saying is I think that this is one of the fundamental original things with Heidegger that goes beyond contributions, whatever he's saying in these 50 pages. And it's if you see philosophy as a series of interpretations of Aristotle, and there's the Neoplatonic, Avicenna, Aquinas, Galileo, Heidegger is the reinterpreter of Aristotle for the modern or postmodern age. And the difference that he identifies, announces, is the philosophy had always been driven by the sense of wonder since Aristotle, and it's in the modern age that we now have this unease or uncanny. And the reason we do philosophy now is because of this sense of the uncanny rather than wonderment at nature, which was part of our ontology up until now, up until Heidegger.
I think that's fair, but the question arises, what causes the sense of the uncanny? I haven't answered that, but if others have a thought on it first, I'm open to other people taking a stab at that. I have my own answer to that, though. But other reactions to what I've said so far? Dan?
Yeah, I I agree with you, and this is kind of what's I think it's so difficult to Heidegger. It's difficult to approach him if you don't have this kind of feeling of not being at home in the world, or that something is out of joint. It's very difficult to approach Heidegger because it's kind of, it starts there. It starts in that kind of a what's called mood or attunement with the world. That some things only appear if you are there. Like all these kind of arguments and end of the end of metaphysics, the what's a first start, the second start, and so on. They appear only if you go there, if you follow this kind of I don't know, alienation, disenchantment, but I will call it like, I think that's a better word. Something is out of joint with the world, and you need to follow that, stay with that, and go. Don't like he also mentioned like restraint and steadfastness and struggle and so on. So you keep those and stay with them, not despairing and not hoping or not, just stay with that and see where they take you. And if you do that, then I think all these things that Heidegger is talking, especially here, start to make sense. So it has nothing to do with logic, with arguments or something like that. Arguments kind of come afterwards, or only to make points here and there, weak points. But the fundamental thing is this kind of attunement and mood. And the basic mood, as you say now, is that something is out of joint with the world, or we are not at home in this world anymore, or not totally at home. And it's, yeah.
Yeah, and I would put this just psychologically simply for folks who might not get that attitude. And I'll put it in technological terms, even though I think these terms distort what he's saying, but I think that modern people can hear it. If I'm a meaning detector and you put me in a world without meaning, I will not stop detecting meaning. I will detect that something is missing, and I will miss missing meaning like I would miss my right leg if you cut it off. I will feel the phantom missing limb of where is my meaning, because I'm built around being oriented on something like meaning. So meaningless worlds, Dasein doesn't exist in a meaningless world. The world Dasein lives in is always meaningful, and if you take away transcendent sources of meaning, other things like bustle will come in as distraction, yes, but the other thing that will happen is a sense of unease will arise from it seeming like meaning is missing. I can also put it in later cognitive psych terms. When you're in explored territory, because all of your calculations seem to be working, you are you have a sense of at ease with things. When you know you are in unexplored territory, you are on alert. You have a sense of the uncanny. You have a sense that things are out of joint, simply because you acknowledge that you do not know what is happening. You do not know what is going on. You feel like you're in unexplored territory. So the feeling that one is in unexplored territory in the modern world is this unease foreboding business he's talking about in like our second section. And we can see sort of psychologically where that arises. We can see some of that as a version of reaction to the same experiences that Nietzsche calls nihilism. But he also calls this restraint. Why does he call this restraint? Because it's a not rushing into what modernity seems to promise. It is a holding back with a sense of both that it would be improper and that it would be dangerous to embrace the bustle of modernity, to embrace an instrumental view of reason and be resigned to the fact that reason is purely instrumental. or that thinking is purely in the service of the passions or anything like that. So this holding back, this restraint, and this foreboding about things, the sense of things being out of joint, is all related to an attunement / mood experience of something like Nietzschean nihilism, that he is calling a basic attitude that makes possible the first beginning. We already saw in Being in Time that Heidegger claimed that attunement was one of the basic modes of revealing, one of the basic ways you understand situatedness in the world, something like that, is that you have moods at all, right? Not the particular mood that you have, but that you have moods at all. And even in pure anthropology or pure cog-psych senses of that, we can see a sense in that. But he's tying this to a philosophical sense. There's supposed to be something like purpose and meaning in some spiritual way for man's essence, something like that. We saw that in the what is called Thinking, where he talked about the fundamental thing to be thankful for is our essence, that we are thinking beings, something like that. And if that's missing, if that's absence, if that's degraded, we feel like something is off, right? So that's the first point here, and that's also, in a way, in a more resigned way, the same thing you see in Weber talking about the disenchantment of the world, or the technological world as an iron cage, right? That same attitude is there, and you might even say that some of this is there are people who give a political interpretation of this as the Romantics and the dispossessed cultural conservatives and dispossessed nobilities are missing the social role that they once had, right? And there's an element of that. There's an element of unsettledness in that, but it's also just a feeling that the center is missing, right? That any organizing center or higher purpose is missing, that would organize human activity in some ordered way that was not just the result of power, calculation, scramble, something like that. Okay. Other people have reactions to that set of things. The idea that what we're dealing with here is a fundamental attitude / experience of a disenchanted or seemingly meaningless world. James.
Yeah, that was that exposition really hit home for me, and it reminded me of one of the things that's always tricky in Heidegger, which we forget about when we get into some of the details of these things, when he's talking about sort of the devolution of culture and philosophy from the beginning to now because of modern technology and modern science and such, is that it's always hard to say, put an absolute value of good and bad from Heidegger's perspective on this, because there's a sense in which, yes, there's this devolution, over the past 2 millennia, from the pre-Socratics to now. But then there's also a sense in which it kind of had to come to this point, because if the whole feeling that you're talking about of feeling out of joint, the loss of center, loss of meaning, etc., it's going to be sort of a launching pad for Heidegger from here to rethink Dasein's position, relationship to being, and it wouldn't exist in that radical of a way, and we wouldn't experience it in such a radical way if philosophy hadn't sort of evolved to this point where it's at with modern science and technology. So there's this double-edged, thinking here that's going on, right? And sort of there's a implicit criticism, but then it's going to be used as a launching pad into, this other beginning, another possibility, another way of thinking, sort of Dasein's future possibilities from here.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I'm thinking in Question Concerning Technology, he talks about, where the danger is, there also arises the saving power. There's a notion in which this springboard or this turnaround as being something which could be transformative for man's experience of being, something like that. But it's first necessary to see that it is an impasse and a difficulty which creates the springboard, right? So you're right that he wants to take this into a direction of a what can change this, but the starting point is something which is already of itself calling for a change on a particularly fundamental level. So some of this we already saw in Nietzsche talking about nihilism as something to be overcome. We can go through Heidegger's reasons for not thinking that Nietzsche's way of thinking about overcoming nihilism is remotely going to work, but there's still that problem there. In the word of Nietzsche, and also I think in Question Concerning Technology, if I'm not mistaken, he refers to this as, what do we see going on here? And his answer is, nothing is happening to being. This is his phrase for nihilism. And what he means by that is that there is some actual appearing to of transcendent truth to man, which has eclipsed, and a nothing is happening in the space of the transcendent instead. So this phrase, nothing is happening to being, is in a way a short formula for this sense of what is missing in this mood of foreboding. In a period in which nothing is happening to being, this sense of foreboding is the accurate sense of what is transpiring at the level of being itself. And I can put this in older tradition terms. Revelation has ceased. Prophecy has ceased. Even the philosophical versions of these things have ceased. The most important thing going on right now is that God and man are not on speaking terms. Being is not announcing itself to thinkers, right? So there is an eclipse of being to thought. And the Heidegger's term for this here is the plight of the abandonment by being. So there's a sense of there being a kind of ordering stability in access to truth, spiritual access to truth, as being something which is fundamental to man's calling or nature, an expectation that man is, I'm going to be technological here again, wired to have. And when that feels missing, we get this out of joint business. And that out of joint business is telling us that there is something off in being not speaking to man. And in a way, that's Heidegger's reinterpretation of Nietzsche's God is dead. He's just flipped the agency. It's less that men killed God than that God stopped speaking to man. Those are two sides of the same event from Heidegger's point of view, right? But he thinks that the latter of them is, in a way, a more accurate read of it. Of course, when he says, when I put in those terms, there's this philosophical to religious/spiritual equation that both Nietzsche and Heidegger indulge in, and he really means a philosophical relation, not primarily a religious relation. But when we talk about the absconding of the gods and the possible advent of the last god, we're going to see that that doesn't simply hold all the way. Again, the point of all this is, if you think of nothing happening to being and the plight of abandonment by being as being different phrases for the same event, a nihilism in which being is eclipsed, in which thinkers cannot see being, right? And that this creates a ripple effect from the absence of an insight, of an ordering insight that should be there but is not. That has rippling effects for the rest of human existence. It lacks that ordering purpose and center and grounding in something like service to truth. Okay, so that's sort of basic attitude of why we're here at all, thinking about anything like a new beginning. There is a where we are now that we have an unease about, that is already an intimation that we, in some sense, don't belong here, right? That's the underlying thing in that foreboding, in that out of jointness. I'm going to give a chance for people to, react to what I've just said so far as laying this out and tying it into these phrases like nothing is happening to being and so on. Is this getting clearer about what his sort of origin, motivation slash, starting point is? Okay. If no more questions on that, I'll just say that putting it back in Weber's term for a second, Heidegger is asking, what would it take for man to listen to being again, for being to talk to man again, for the world to seem to have meaning again, for nihilism to be superseded by something else, for ordering meaning to return, for the world to be re-enchanted. The last part in quotes because it's not an actual return to what it was just before. Okay. If that's the basic structure of what we're talking about here, now maybe we can ask, what does Heidegger mean by a new beginning? So he's harking back to the beginning of Western thinking in the Greeks, and he's saying something was founded there where discoveries about being were made, being was heard. The discovery of nature was a listening to being, discovering of nature as the Greeks had it. The turning around toward truth in Plato's cave, right, was such a reorientation. In the Essence of Truth essay, we saw him talk about how Socrates, both in that turnaround and that orientation upon truth, and in understanding of knowing or thinking as the sensorium of being, the sense for being, and the common, right? All of that was something which gave mankind a mission to serve truth about nature, to discover truth about nature for thousands of years. And that orienting purpose, man should come to know the truth about nature, structured Western society from the Greeks to now. You can call that structure in its limitations, its thoughts and unthoughts, metaphysics if you want, but it's also just the career of the West from the very beginnings of Greek thinking to everything revealed by modern science, right? There's been this orienting of service to truth and discovery as man's highest calling that's been there since the Greeks. That's the level of event that Heidegger is talking about when he's talking about another beginning. He's talking about an impetus of that scope and character renewed. So you can think of this as having a conservative and a revolutionary aspect. As a conservative aspect because it's trying to revisit what was done there and understand that tradition in total and to understand the service of truth and all of that. But it's also revolutionary because it's finding something flawed in how that was done. It's wanting to redo something on that civilizational scale, hopefully as supplement to it. But there is both, it's this paradox of something which is conservative and revolutionary at the same time is the point I'm trying to make, right? In its relation to the tradition and its relation to philosophy as its ideal, and it's taking the first beginning as the model for what should happen, for creating such an orienting purpose for man in service of truth. There is an element of traditionalism or conservatism or longing for the spiritual leadership that philosophy showed in its age of wonder, or something like that. And that is in clear continuity with the tradition, the older parts of the tradition especially, as opposed to more recent parts which are skeptical of some of that. Okay, but the other part of it is there's an element of it which is revolutionary on that level because we're talking about taking things which are set down by Plato and Aristotle and changing them, right? Which is potentially a reordering of civilizational scale forces of that scope. Okay. And he'll insist that these things, thinking philosophy like this, is open and exposed in the following sense. You don't do those things so that some human purpose can be realized by doing them. This is not a power machination. Man is not going to be in charge of the consequences of such a reorientation. The truth is going to be in charge of them. If man is serving truth in these things, then what man winds up doing and how it winds up affecting him as a result of all that is not going to be decided simply by man. It's going to be decided by the other side of the equation, by being and truth and what is, not by what man wants, not by his purposes, right? So compared to Nietzsche's attempt to overcome metaphysics with a human willing, setting one purpose for mankind, Heidegger is deeply skeptical of purposes for mankind set by men. He can tell where that ends. It ends in a power struggle, right? And who wins that power struggle? Whoever is better is accumulating power, and who does that? Whoever treats man as raw material, not an end, right? But actual ends have to be set by a standard outside of man's will. They have to be set by truth. They have to be set by being. They're revealed. They're not revealed or discovered. They're not willed and created for a technological purpose. Okay, so that's in a way in his reaction to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's attempt to overcome nihilism isn't going to work, and he can explain why. That's the whole connection of machinations and technology, and it's also there in all the worldview stuff and ideology stuff and totalizing ideologies, which we may get to. But the desired or attempted or idealized or possible replacement for that is something more like a truth and being in charge of the relation, setting purposes and duties to man. All right. I'm going to pause there and let people react to that basic sketch of what a new beginning would mean at all before we talk about the structure of a new beginning. Joe.
I always have trouble unmuting. So it seems to me that he's making some indirect or discovery, it might be said, of a concept I know in economics called spontaneous order, the order that occurs in society as humans go about pursuing their ordinary goals, whatever they may be. And this order is a spontaneous order. It's not designed or it's not set up by some kind of great thinker. There's an analogy here also to what Darwin was talking about with the evolution of species, but this is it's not exactly the same thing because it's social, it's human, and not just the animal natural world. But
so this spontaneous sort of thing.
This.
So let's tie that what you said about spontaneous order. I mean, he mentioned something like that very directly on page 33. This is in the middle of section 14. Sorry, on the right-hand side, it's the third paragraph down, the one that starts the essence of worldview. But in the last sentence of that, everywhere is lacking, he's talking about in worldview, everywhere is lacking a sense of the necessity of what has come to be by growing, but also thereby, in a sense, the abyssal character of what is created. The point there, that's very close to your spontaneous order point, is what I'm trying to say. And he's contrasting that with what happens in worldview ideologies, where nothing is spontaneous, everything is calculated, everything is for a power advantage, right? Now, where there's a little bit of a complication here, though, is your spontaneous order point can be reached for by people who are firmly in the Nietzschean camp, if you get me. What do I mean by that? Nietzsche says that every drive, wants to tyrannize in its own way. Every drive has its own will to power. The thing which is creating the ends which are posited in all the different ideologies are interests and life drives of different things. They all compete with one another. That competition gives rise to winners and losers. The winning in that can be thought of as a process of natural selection, right? And the survivors of that process of natural selection are the successful power accumulators in that sort of Nietzschean wills are mocked, version of things. To Heidegger, all of that is still technology. It's still just exactly what it teaches us to reduce formations of thought into expressions of drives and interests that are fundamentally pre-rational, pre-human, and impersonal forces. And then to think of the historical processes as being processes of strife and competition among those impersonal forces, in which competition, reason, thought, etc., are just weapons and tools. They're weapons and tools of the drives.
Sounds like Nietzsche was influenced by Marx, or the Hegel tendency there, of whatever we're talking about.
This
Anyway,
idea of historical competition leading to the success of something that deserves to win was running all through the 19th century in ideas of progress. You find it in Darwin, you find it in Marx, you find it in Hegel, you find it in Malthus, you find it in lots of places, right? But and that's certainly there in Nietzsche. The thing which Nietzsche has added to it is he doesn't think that those interests are particularly rational. He thinks that they are life-like, but not thought-like. Right? They are like things which are alive. They are like drives, but they are not like thoughts. They are not rational. They are not Hegelian philosophical thoughts or systems or worldviews, right? And worldviews themselves are expressions of such concentrated interests. So that worldviews themselves are primarily not rational creations. They're primarily poems of this or that drive, right? They are a construct that organizes things from the point of view of this collection of interests. They appeal to people who share those interests. They seem to explain the world from the standpoint of which those interests are uppermost. And that's how they function. But that functions effectively as a kind of capture of the individuals trapped within it by those leading drives that they share with lots of other people. And Heidegger points out in this discussion of worldview here is that that's always a narrowing down of possibilities. It's always a closing off of things because it's closed off to what is shared with the rest of the people inside the power formation. But that power formation is selected for in your self-organization sense, or in your spontaneous order sense. The thing which is spontaneous is not necessarily order, is the point that I'm getting to. Where the order that is spontaneous may be a power order, not a moral order, right? Heidegger is much less impressed with the morality of those things in general. But when he talks about what grows of its own and the abyssal character of what is creative, he is trying to say that it is possible for something to have a connection with being, meaning, truth, such that it is it does tend towards order and not just towards power competition, something like that. But that to him it's a kind of spiritual and moral contrast. It's not just a what works contrast. The reduction of what counts as order to whatever wins is precisely this instrumental view of reason, modern Nietzschean technological perversion of rationality, if that makes sense. Okay. So, Dan.
Yeah, on this, so on the previous book that I read on Hölderlin, like Nietzsche, Heidegger says that both Hölderlin and Nietzsche are the same thing, like they got on the Greek, ancient Greeks, but then Nietzsche, Heidegger says something, he got influenced by Schopenhauer, Wagner, and Darwin, and he went into this direction, while Hölderlin stay on that vein, on the ancient Greek vein. And I think what Heidegger is kind of this conceptual thinking is like that starts from nothing almost, is like it's a poetical thinking, goes back to Hölderlin. That's why Heidegger is admiring Hölderlin so much. It's something like that, and goes back, like Parmenides, when Parmenides says being is. So I think that's the kind of thing that along those lines something might start from something like that is in tune there with being, and it's a saying of that kind that opens a new realm, and that's the second beginning. If there is something, it's something along those lines.
So yes, on the connection to Hölderlin and back to the pre-Socratics, I think Heraclitus, even more than Parmenides, is akin here, but not simply the Greeks. Hölderlin is an example of this kind of romantic sense of something missing in a disenchanted world, a sense of wanting to recover some of that enchantment. Honestly, most of the philosophy you find in Hölderlin is not yet up to the level of anything you find in Heidegger. It's mostly Hegel, to the extent there is any. And his harking back to the Greeks is fundamentally poetic. It's not fundamentally philosophic, right? He doesn't have. He appreciates the artistic form of the Greek gods and what they mean about feeling the artist or the artistic temperament feeling like he is living in a world of meaning. And some of that is projected back, right? It's not necessarily something that was there in the pagan world. It's projected back into the pagan world by a modern romantic, something like that. But yes, that's the direction this is pointing for what counts as meaningfulness. How much of that is nostalgia? We'll have to see. How much of this is indebted to other things that are in the tradition, all the way from the ancients and the Greeks to people like Hegel. Maybe more than Heidegger lets on. We'll have to see. But at any rate, it is a dissatisfaction with the not just the excessive rationalism and skepticism of modernity, but with the fact that that has now, after Nietzsche, somersaulted into a drives uppermost reason merely subordinate tool, right? And Heidegger experiences that as a disordering of essential priority relations, something like that. And you could say that some of this is a temperamental difference between Nietzsche and Heidegger. Nietzsche has the exemplar of the willful, commanding warrior lion, something like that. We'll come to that in a second. But in contrast, Heidegger's is much more of the priest, spiritualist, quietist with the mystic's private revelatory experience. Now, the reality is, if you go to Nietzsche, he is going to admit that the latter is more like what he has himself, and that a lot of the warrior lion business is just posing and rhetoric, right? You want the, what does he say at one point? He says, the way to get brave people on your side is to make something appear dangerous, right? As a matter of rhetoric. This is something Nietzsche says. If you want brave people to flock to your cause, just present it as really dangerous, and then all the brave people, in order to parade their virtue of bravery, will flock to your banner so that they can be on the dangerous side, so everyone will know how brave they are, right? And the point is, there's things like that you get in Nietzsche that are just rhetoric. When he's telling you where Nietzsche himself gets his philosophical thoughts, he will tell you thoughts that come on dove's feet guide the world, and his stillest hour is what he's listening to, and all that kind of stuff, which is much closer to where Heidegger thinks these things are actually heard and learned, if you get me. Pete, did you have a thought?
So not necessarily about that directly, but I just wanted to ask, since we're already gotten to page 30, I was wondering what you made of all the mentions of the great stillness, restraint, diffidence.
Yes.
Is he merely saying, well, you can't figure this out willfully, using your ego, or by design using rationalism? You have to sit and listen for the answer, for the truth. Is there more there than just you can't willfully find the truth?
There is, and we'll get to some of that. I skipped over the structure stuff in 3 that I want to come back to, but I wanted to make sure we had this grounding in mood and what sort of change we're talking about in the first place. But briefly on your exact question, Heidegger thinks that besides the reversal of agency of something like truth or being has to be in charge, there is also a humility non-possession, if I get it that way. Philosophy doesn't have the truth. Philosophy has to be questioning, and questioning without knowing what the answer is going to be. This is despite foreboding, right? This is the remaining element of wonder discovery, right? So there is an openness to philosophy, which is that it is always questioning. It is questioning about what it does not know. It is questioning into a mystery. And that always has the element of discovery and listening and waiting for truth or being to disclose itself, rather than prescribing to. And the primary reason for that contrast is this cul-de-sac of the Nietzschean attempt to overcome nihilism willfully, also to avoid any of the totalizing ideologies that pretend that they already have all the answers and therefore cannot tolerate openness of questioning. But it's also just the honest approach to anything like this new beginning. It's new. You do not know what to do, right? And we'll get to the structural moments of the transition in just a second, but here's what Heidegger doesn't want. He doesn't want the desire to re-enchant the world to result in people promulgating or accepting ancient lies. If this whole thing is going to be in service of truth, it can't be some noble lie that's just, used in a machination way to organize humanity in service of some, past traditional ideal, for example, right? He does not want to go back to a pre-enlightenment world in which lies could pass for truth because there was no skeptical thought or there was no questioning. That's not the sort of re-enchantment he's looking for. The re-enchantment he's looking for is whatever was truthful in the underlying experiences that led to finding meaning in the world has to be re-experienced and recaptured. When people in the past experienced meaningfulness in the world, they were doing so not just because they believed untruths that had been layered on top of things, but because of some primary experience of attunement, some primary experience towards meaning that Heidegger thinks needs to be recapitulated, rethought, re-experienced. So he does not want to bring up the lies of the past, if that makes sense. And that's also part of this. It has to be questioning, it has to be listening, right? So none of this can be presented as already having the answers. Heidegger in another place calls this, it only proceeds as a feeling of a fundamental lack. You know that something is missing. You have some intimation from that of what might fulfill it, of what might fill that void, but you cannot prescribe either what will fill that void or that the void will actually be filled, even if you know what would fill it. That X would fill it doesn't mean X is. Men don't decide such things. So back in the Theaetetus, if you recall, the argument against Protagoras that Socrates ended up with was that man is not the measure of truth because a God is the measure of truth, right? Man cannot be the standard. There's something like that here again, but now it's, recurring to that Socratic formula, but now it's being is the standard, right? Man cannot make this stuff up. Okay, but let's.
Right. So this is the fact that in the Theaetetus we required a God to give us meaning,
Or to give us the measure.
how-
To give us the measure, and that was trying to say that something like a God or truth had to be the measure that man or opinion could not be in the older dispensation.
Yeah, and then the absconding God is that we still had this Christian God in the background through the Enlightenment that was still giving meaning. And now finally that God's absconded and we don't have anything to give us meaning and chant our lives.
Something like that, although we'll get to what the absconding amounts to in more detail a little bit later because it gets a little bit complicated, but not completely off. Dan, you had a thought?
Yeah, I think man is not going to make this meaning, but needs to say it, and it's said by staying attuned to being, and it's a simple one, and it's primitive, and like restraint is staying there and waiting for that simple thing to say it, to like get in tune with it and say it, and I think that's the point here.
Eventually, possibly, but that saying has to be a questioning saying, and it has to be a listening saying. It can't be a willful saying or a preachy saying, if you get me. But let's jump to 3 now for a second, because we've got at least enough background here that we understand why there would be something like a desire for a new beginning at all, and what level of something would have to be to count as a new beginning, right? It would have to be something like a recapitulation of the attachment of man to truth and discovery of truth that was there in the Greeks, something like that, but that is capable of overturning the impasses of Nietzschean relativism and power politics and technology and purely instrumental view of reason, and is capable of affecting change on that level, but is based in truth, is based in a listening, is not a willful machination, itself. All right. The top of three, we get these short words: the resonating, the interplay, the leap, the grounding, the future ones, and the last God. What the heck are these things? Why are they here? I'm going to start by just laying some things down, and just trust me for a second and see if they start to make sense. But for the resonating, put in whatever seems to be going on with being in nihilism. The nothing happening to being, along with the sense that things are out of joint, right? Anything like the situation we've just described, think of that from the standpoint of what is happening to being in that situation, and call that just the resonating. We'll get to why it's called the resonating when we, much later in the book. But I want you just to think of that first mode as the present situation, before any new beginning, before any change. You're in Nietzschean nihilism, nothing is happening to being, the world seems out of joint, right? And those experiences are there, but nothing more than that is there yet. The interplay. Interplay is going to happen as soon as there are two things. What are the two things? The old beginning and the new beginning. If you've got to have a two-ness, you have to have an interplay between the two-ness. There has to be some relation between them, purely structurally. If there's going to be a new beginning, there's going to be some way in which the new beginning is like, and some way in which the new beginning is unlike the first beginning. There is something which the new beginning will take from the first beginning and be like it, in attachment to truth perhaps, and others which will be different, which will overturn its attitude towards time perhaps. But there is some interplay between the original beginning and the new beginning, right? So from the resonating of the initial system is not completely stable, because there's some unrest in it. That's the original resonating idea. To an interplay of there's an A and a possible B, which is still only a possible B, but that's already causing an interplay between what would be the first beginning, what would be the second beginning. The leap is the idea that if you're going to have a new beginning, it's going to be a beginning. So it's going to be a leaving of the old structure and a going to live and inhabit and think in the new structure. So the leap is the idea that whatever the new beginning is, it has to actually start, and that start is going to be a leap of transformation out of the original orientation into the new one. The grounding is going to be, you can't leap and land on nothing. You have to land somewhere. There has to be something you land on. If you're going to land on something, that something has to be grounded. There has to be something which is the new ground on which man stands, from which he takes his orientation, from which he takes his mission in truth. That's what the grounding is about. The future ones are the people that live there. Whoever lives in that new grounding, whoever takes his standards from that new situation in the new beginning, that new orientation, that is a future one. It's not a current one because this hasn't happened yet. But if there is going to be any new beginning, then there must be future ones who live in that grounding, having already transversed the leap. And then the last one there, the last God. Why is that there? Because these future ones in that grounding cannot get all of their standards and orientation merely from the fact that they have surpassed the Greeks. They're not going to be defined by their difference from the first beginning. They're going to live in their new world. In that new world, there'll be something which is the orienting highest or set of values, or whatever you want to call it, that is orienting that future one's world, the world of future ones living in the new ground, having done the leap. And they will have left, at that point, they will leave the interplay and the leap behind. There's no leaving of the interplay and the leap behind if the only thing you are is the posing future one who pretends that you're beyond the Greeks because you're not Greek anymore. Man cannot live on the contrast with the first beginning, or it's not a real beginning. The new beginning has to have its own structure of order, and that own structure of order is going to include a vertical dimension, not just a temporal dimension, not just the I'm not what came before, but there is a highest in whatever that new dispensation is. My claim is, as just sketched, each of these different things is a purely structural requirement for anything like a new beginning that has its own sense of mission, purpose, and order requires. I claim that they have no further content yet when first sketched than that. He can tell that there will be structural moments required for anything like a transition on this scale to happen, and they don't have content yet other than their role in that transition scheme. If you're going to have a new beginning in Western philosophy that's on the same scale of the attachment to the truth about nature that was there in the Greeks, that is instead going to be something like an attachment to the truth about unique things happening in history as events, if that sort of reorientation of man's purpose is going to happen, these steps/stages will be gone through. The last one of them may be controversial in that. He anticipates that, and the way he puts the last God thing is only that it is the decision about the arrival or continued absence of the last God. In other words, in the future world, there will be not the certainty of one outcome of that decision, but only that decision will be made there. Put it this way. Will the future dispensation after this transition be one in which man's spiritual life includes a religious life? Future men are going to decide that on the other ground. Men now are not going to decide that. If men now tried to decide that, they'd be engaged in a machination. They wouldn't be open to whatever happens. But what's actually going to happen is that decision will be made in the future by future men living in the new dispensation, not by present men living in the old one. So after the revolution, people will decide whether or not there are gods in the new order. People in the old order don't get to decide such things. That is the structural form of what the last God entry is doing there. But the fact that he's holding out the possibility that one of the things that might be the case in the other beginning, in the order set by the other beginning, is that it might be a religious order, is again harking back to this idea that this is about a finding meaning again and a re-enchantment of the world. The God is dead of Nietzsche, in the Word of Nietzsche essay, in which nothing is happening to being, is accepted by Heidegger as the truth now, but not as a truth for all time. He's claiming that can change. And the only way to claim that the statement that God is dead can change is to raise the possibility of a future decision as to a possible arrival or continued absconding of the last God. Right. So I've structurally explained why that moment is there. I don't know that there's much more to it than that. We'll get to, at this stage, he hasn't shown us more to it than that. But I already can show you why those 6 things are necessary, how they cohere, and how they formally, outwardly describe necessary moments of anything like a transition to a new beginning that is a new spiritual attachment of man to a mission in truth. Something like that. Thoughts or questions on that sketch of what 3 is about? Pete.
So why is it called of the event, these 6?
Right. Because event is meant in 2 senses. First is the event of the new beginning happening would be a unique happening in history that hasn't happened before. And whether that event happens, that contingent future, is what is at play, at stake in all of this. That's the first meaning. In that meaning, the event is a unique event which may be ongoing or may be in the future, but it is a single unique event. It doesn't have the character of a class. The second meaning of event, though, is what he calls the grounding question as opposed to the guiding question. The old guiding question in metaphysics was, what are beings? The new grounding question, which is like moment 4, is how does being essentially occur? And the claim is going to be that how being essentially occurs is as event. Why does that matter? This is part of the change from the Platonic metaphysical world and its relation to time, and the new beginning and its relation to time, how being essentially occurs is it happens as event. It happens as unique in history. It happens as the arising, appearing of being to man, being as meaningful to man as shepherd of being. And that essential way in which being happens is the content of the grounding that is the new side of the new beginning. So the point is, event points to the fundamental truth that or kind of truth that the new beginning should have philosophy be about, but it can also refer to the event of transition from one to the other as a unique happening in history. I'll pause for comments on that, because those two senses of what he means by event oscillate. Sometimes it means a one-time thing, and sometimes it means just how being always essentially unfolds. So how general it is and how specific it is oscillates.
Right.
I'm impressed by the idea that it's punctuated by temporality. I'm going to yield to Pete because I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, that's okay. I was going to say that. So there's two senses of event. Well, one is always going on, in that if something presences to me, that's an event to me. And then there's
Operative word "an."
And then there's the first time an event happened. And that's the originary event. So I don't know, I guess while I was looking at this list, I was trying to fit something into this rubric. And so I was thinking, okay, back in the Greek days, there's lightning, and Heidegger's big on lightning. And lightning came from Zeus. And then 500 years ago, there was an originary event where some scientist thought up, oh, maybe lightning's not Zeus, it's the potential difference in static electricity between clouds that causes this. And so at that point, that's an originary event that then you have all six of these apply. There's the old way, the Zeus way. There's the interplay between the new and the old. The new, you have to make the leap, abandon the theological explanation for the science.
But at this point, we've turned this structure of six things, which is meant to be the uniform transition between the age of metaphysics and the Heideggerian new beginning, into just Thomas Kuhn writ small, right? No.
Right. Well, so since you don't have the new beginning yet, so I can't use that as an example.
Pete, you're right, but I want to point out, and I'm not just joking when I bring up Thomas Kuhn, because people like that are trying to take this structure he's described and think of it in the old metaphysical way as just a pattern that you can stamp over things and find all kinds of cookies that fit it, right? But for Heidegger, the resonating and interplay leading to the leap into the new grounding is not something that happens every time someone revises a scientific theory, right? It is not the structure of scientific revolutions. It is one transition in human thought, which is just now beginning to be possible. And the thing to understand here is that the older dispensation saw value in thoughts precisely from their pattern-like generality and the number of places and times they could be used to refer, because it was looking for Platonic ideas. It was looking for patterns that are generalizations that can be used in many situations. This is exactly the orientation that the new beginning drops. The old metaphysical understanding is that things that happen only once are accidents and unimportant, and only things I can generalize to many new situations are useful tools to take along with me as those new situations arise. And it only sees value in thought to the extent that it finds patterns that can be guides to new situations where those generalizations hold. That's the old nature Greek philosophical into scientific generalization understanding that to Heidegger is Platonism. Whereas historical understanding, conceptual thinking, is about first beginnings and the meanings in single events that are unique, that do not generalize, right? There's a section, I forget exactly the page, but he talks about the futureless ones. And he's thinking of the Greeks. The futureless ones who are always only eternal. He's using terms like not having a future or being eternal as terms of diminishment, right? And he's contrasting with the future ones who occur only once. The futureless ones don't occur once. They're just a pattern. So the sharpest mark yet of transition to historical content, man's essential relation to a time is at stake. For Platonists and Christians, only eternal in the truth they seek and long for. So they're not looking for truth in the moment. They're not looking for truth in the event. They're not looking for truth in the unique or the personal. They're only looking for truths which are outside time and are for all time and thus generalize. They're only looking for patterns. But the meaning in an event doesn't just come from its patternness or from its applicability to future cases that haven't been tried. The meaning comes for what? For Heidegger, it comes from projection. Projection is the essential structure of meaning, and projection is about ownmost possibilities. It's about decisions. What matters is what decides whether or not this happens or that happens. What decides whether I go this way or I go that way. The decision points of navigating the branching time space of actual possibilities is what confers meaning on an event independent of its generality. It's not its meaning for 16 different experiences I may have later. It's not its usability as a pattern. It's this decision right now, which happens only once, means the world goes down fork A or the world goes down fork B. The world will never be there again. But whether or not it goes to A or B is going to be decided now. Seeing meaning in that now and in that decision is the sense of meaning involved in conceptual thinking, and it doesn't come from generality and it doesn't come from pattern. Because of that, I think that this resonating of the different meanings of how general event is critical to what's going on here. And for Heidegger, the highest meaning of event is the singular one, not the plural one. It's not what every discovery has in common. It's this one discovery. The discovery of Dasein is the ground of man's historical existence, right? That transition matters more for what will be in the future because it's the actual decision of man will live in way A or man will live in way B. So it's that sense of the meaning freighted into the individual happening as the branch point in time space, as the branch point in what where the time pilot pilots his time, right? That and not a generalization and not a applicability as though you're going to be at all these places 1,000 times in the future and therefore you want something that works for 990 of them, right? Is what the new attachment to truth or meaning that he is talking about in the conceptual thinking is about. Dan, questions, thoughts?
Yeah, first related to this, I think at the very end of our readings that there is probably need to go into that beingness and what he means by beingness and generalization versus uniqueness and understand the event versus metaphysics in that framework. But going back to the 6 steps, and I totally that's how I understood these 6 steps also. But for example, for the last God, I understood it in a more stronger sense, in a more necessary. So it's kind of like it's a horizon and it's necessary there, and it's not like it's that future, whatever world it's with or without religion. It's on a horizon, and we need that, and it's not about religion. It's beyond that, and it may happen or it may not happen. All we need is be prepared and hope for it and be ready. But if that doesn't happen, it seems like this entire scheme fails. It's not like it's kind of an optional thing in the scheme. It's necessary. That's at least how I understood it. It's a stronger requirement. It's not optional. The future ones, like for me, it seems like Heidegger has this philosophy that you just need like a few determined individuals. So it's not about a society or whatever, a new world, but it's a handful of individuals that start this, and so the future ones are the few ones that do this. And then the leap, it's kind of like, to me, it's kind of very important. It's danger, it's steadfastness. It's not a transition. It's something that you jump there, and you may jump into abyss, and you may bend. You never know what's there, and it's kind of like the leap is, to me, was quite important in this scheme. That's all I want to say.
And we'll get to all the details of leap when we get the whole section about it. But I want to give Isabel a chance. Isabel.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. By the way, I agree with Dan about the leap. I just wonder, Jason, a little bit about translations. If you say the new beginning, should not that be the other beginning? The other beginning? Because remember, the minute you use new, well, you're going into complications like what Pete was saying, this and that. And also Heidegger is
other is the word he uses, but yeah. You're right, that other is the word rather than new, but yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, yes, but that does make a difference, Jason.
I agree.
It does.
The amendment is friendly. You're correct.
All right. Well, thank you. That's I thought that's what brings a lot of complications. And remember that Heidegger is never disciplinary. He's not that first beginning of that horrible. No, not at all. Being chose to be being in that particular way. Thank you.
Sure. There is a truth of the appearance of being in the first beginning, which remains true, right? Certainly. Joe? Getting mood off.
Yeah. I appreciated that example you gave earlier about the moment when a choice is being made and there are two paths that diverge. The more serious part of my comment is that there is a nice short little book by Nobel laureate James Buchanan with the title Cost and Choice, in which, in economic context, he makes it very clear that the costs of things are all involved with the moment of choice and determining the future from that point. So therefore, one could say in a snide way that he's sort of dismissing all of accounting as a body of work. But that's not true. I mean, it's a really interesting point, and the point you made, or you said that Heidegger is also making. Now, the more humorous side of the commentary is that there are many, many science fiction stories with the so-called alternate universe hypothesis coming in which somebody does and somebody doesn't do something, and then the consequences that happen. I suppose the more simple non-science fiction-y one, is the Christmas movie with Jimmy Stewart. But, that's just, this idea of the event being the moment that great division of what is the real world after it happens is very interesting. So thank you.
Sure. I want to just highlight a little bit more of this. This is stuff on page 16, where he talks about all beginnings in themselves being unsurpassably complete. You have to notice first the paradox there that he's intending to surpass a beginning, which he says they're unsurpassable. But he says they escape historiology, not because they are supertemporal or eternal, but rather because they are greater than eternity. Not a phrase you would normally find in a Platonist. The strokes of time which grant to being the openness of its self-concealment. So the idea that there are strokes of time in which truth appears, something like that, and that in that those are greater than eternity. So this is something like the moments of revelation of truth, and that the moments of revelation of truth are greater than what is stably eternal. And they're greater because why? Because by the standard of projection and meaning, they're more important than something which is, from his point of view, merely always. And he talks about this in terms of the grounding of Dasein and the time space of Dasein, but and the human being as steward of the stillness. So all of this is getting at this notion of truth is a happening, and the service of truth as that happening is what the other beginning is pointed towards. He also says that there's a unique goal of our history, and that goal is seeking itself. So you have to understand the slightly meta thing going on here. The new dispensation, or the other dispensation, to take the correction, it's oriented on seeking itself, right? So it's not the particular thing found. Dan is worried that if the particular thing found is not the last God, that something will have failed. Perhaps, but it will not be up to us whether or not it has failed. Heidegger in his last interview famously said that in the absence of the God, we are in decline, right? And he was not trying to say that as though we could just decide otherwise, right? So he was not saying, you can say that he's saying that something has failed, but that's not how he's putting it. He's just saying this is what is currently happening. Why? Because bearing witness to the truth of what is currently happening, understood on this level, is the actual call and duty involved in thinking. It's not that there be a particular outcome, but that you seek the answers to what is happening and truthfully say them. Jason.
Yeah, I'm curious about this idea of decline. He refers to decline meaning human meaning or human being, or because some people think of decline in terms of economics or any other kind of concept, and I think he's talking about human being.
He's definitely not talking about economically. He's talking about in terms of something like the fulfillment of man's essential nature to be a steward of and to discover truths, to serve truth, something like that. And I don't want to try to interpret this whole last interview as a lot of cryptic things in it, but just to put it in terms of the things here, the promise that the other beginning or another beginning holds out here is for something like a re-deepening of man's spiritual purpose, something like that. And in the absence of that re-deepening, in the absence of that re-deepening becoming something understood or general, he calls that decline. Why is it decline? It's decline because man is living on a lower plane than he could. There's an unrealized potential if man fails to fulfill a spiritual duty that he has. That's the sense of decline he means. Does that make sense?
Yes, but he obviously, when he talks about spirit, he's not talking in a Hegelian sense. I guess spirit is maybe pre-Socratic or something.
I think he means. First of all, I'm using the term spirit rather than him using the term spirit. He would mostly just talk about thinking. But I want to raise the separate question raised by your question of to what degree is any of this Hegelian? Because Heidegger doesn't present any of it as Hegelian. But you could easily see this original beginning, this Greek beginning, and the other beginning as having a dialectical relationship that you could draw straight out of Hegel, and that you might even, through Hegel, draw all the way back to dialectics and people like Dionysius and Neo-Areopagite and Neo-Platonism that were some of Hegel's sources. What do I mean by that? You've got an attachment to truth of nature as truth of the eternal as a thesis in the Greeks, and you have a skeptical attitude towards the transcendent aspect of that turns into an instrumentalization of reason as merely a tool for the drives in the modern antithesis, and we need a higher synthesis that has captured the truths that were there in the Disenchantment, but it is also captured what is happening in this history that is missed by each of them only focusing on the eternal or unchanging. So there's some higher synthesis needed of the moment of first beginning and moment of end of metaphysics nihilism, something like that. If you were committed to finding Hegelianism everywhere, you could probably find some Hegelianism even in this scheme. I don't think that necessarily means this is where he got it, but Hegelianism doesn't claim to be a source of things. It claims to be a pattern seen in things, and that pattern might be here too. But anyway, that's only raised by your bringing up the question of, is this spiritual? By spiritual, does he mean in the Hegelian Geist sense? It's not his conscious intention, but that doesn't mean that Hegel wouldn't have his own reaction to what is going on here with the structure that he is sketching in this book. He might just call it an attempt to write an extra chapter to Phenomenology of Spirit on a higher level of abstraction, so to speak. Dan?
Yeah, going back to that sentence, I also highlight it as very important, and it struck me like all beginnings are in themselves what is unsurpassably complete. And to me, how I understood this, I slightly understood it slightly different than like, or maybe the same, like what Nietzsche or Hegel or everyone else is saying. What they are saying, it's already there in the beginning, in the Greek beginning. It's kind of, it's part of that. They are not stepping outside in any way of what those ancient Greeks said, and this is to me, like, if I can use like from mother physics, is kind of like one of these big bang. Once you are there, you are inside that world. You cannot step outside it. It's determined by those, I don't know, first few seconds. And if a second beginning starts, you are either in the old one or you are in the new one, and there is no way so you are complete. It's unsurpassably complete. You are in a world, and you are there, and you are with the beginning that you are with. And to me, it's kind of like cannot jump between worlds or something like that.
Well, but yes, except we've got a whole third moment of the leap, which is a jumping between worlds, or purports to be. So there's a sense of unsurpassably complete that makes perfect sense here of the perfect tense, right? The event in the past which has been completed and happened cannot be undone. It is burned into the truth of history that, you know, Heraclitus had this discovery, that Socrates had this reaction, whatever, right? And especially in the case of things which are beginnings in that sense, which found whole traditions, which found whole attachments, right? They are unsurpassably complete as those sort of decision points and as those sort of originals that set things along the way. And Heidegger is all about trying to recover those in the sense of being able to re-experience them or travel over that way again oneself as the only way to sort of bring them back into memory, something like that. So in that sense, though, you could easily construct a Heideggerianism of history that would not allow the possibility of ever leaving the one tradition, right? The one tradition would always entail all the future decision points under it. Yes, there could be things afterwards which went a way that was not anticipated, but they never leave the track that was laid down by the first beginnings. And in that sense, there would never be any leaps, and there would never be other beginnings. There would only be one beginning and its later descendants. That's not what we get here at all, right? The other thing I wanted to point out is there's all kinds of things in, not just in Heidegger, but in Nietzsche before Heidegger on history that claims that any of these things necessarily grows in a horizon. It's necessarily finite. That there is a horizon of the world for Dasein in being in time, and you can find echoes of that in Nietzsche on the use and abuse of history for life, about, you know, everything great grows in a horizon. Some of that is also related to what Pete was talking about earlier about there being a sense of the Da or the there that is wider than the individual, right? All of those things are ways of trying to say that the contained horizon-like nature of these structures and worlds it's an essential structure in them, and therefore it's not revisable, something like that. And that doesn't sit terribly well, I have to say, with the idea that you can have a fundamental change in these things. I do think that Heidegger is pointing towards at least a change of emphasis of what philosophy or attachment to truth would focus on, that you can clearly see as a possible change, right? But I think you have to struggle with the fact that this is deliberately paradoxical. He tells you the beginnings are unsurpassable, and he tells you he's going to surpass one of them. Flat out. You just have to face that. That may be only a rhetoric, there may be only a way of stunning you with the paradox, but I think it's not just that. There's something that Heidegger is doing here, which is it's entangled. Its involvement with the tradition is entangled, right? It's not simply independent of the tradition, right? Okay, and that's getting beyond trying to explicate what he's saying to trying to assess some of it. Okay. This was all great. Joe, still comments? Go.
A minute ago, you were discussing a situation in which somebody who would object to what Heidegger was pointing out was that the very first event creates the decision tree that goes down and shows all the branches that happens possibly thereafter in other subsequent decisions. Mm-hmm. But my comment is that it seems to me Heidegger's main point here overall is that time moves. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so you can't have this decision tree thing at the very beginning because and you characterize that as a Platonic thing because it's an eternal and it's always there and it never changes and so forth. And that what Heidegger is basically doing is overthrowing or definitely talking against that basic idea, saying that these events happen. Now, my question is, I understand how these event processes happen at the level of the individual or the individual's very narrow group. Okay, but it seems to me that the fallacy of universalism is being committed once again in our discussion because we're talking about these events that change history. Well, history for me maybe, but are you talking about human history? And that's where I bring my objection in, and I'm asking sort of like, how am I confused on this?
So it's fair, but I mean, there's definitely a cultural elitism, focus on philosophy, focus on the history of the unveiling of truths about being in Heidegger that is taking history and it's degeneralizing it again. He's always doing this degeneralization. You want to think about all the different patterns in history and the history of this person, the history of that person, and the history of their decisions. And he's not interested in that universal. He's interested in the highest. So the history that matters most is the history of being, and the history of being is the history of the thoughts of the greatest thinkers about being, and that's a number of people in Western philosophy that you can count on your fingers and toes, right? You might need your toes, right? You can't just do it on your fingers, right? But the point is, he's talking about a history in which the essential happenings are a very narrow few. He's not talking about the history that matters for every decision of someone when they get up in the morning as to whether or not they go this place or that place first, because he's not interested in the generalization pattern, right? He's not trying to provide guides for someone to distinguish between walking first to Starbucks or first to the grocery store, right? He's trying to distinguish between Western philosophy going down this civilizational branch or that civilizational branch, and his reason for doing that is the same one as before: projection, essential possibilities, uppermost possibilities for action, meaning. Those bigger decisions in scale are where the meaning is, right? And it's not from his point of view, in the old dispensation, the more general the pattern, the more it was expected to matter, right? The fact that it applied to lots of people in their trivial situations meant that it was so general that it was going to be a universal rule, and we could write a law about it, and that made science and discovery of nature and made it important. Not to Heidegger. The single decisions that matter most are where the meaning is concentrated, not the patterns that are universal but trivial in their outcomes. Right? Again, there's a fundamental reorientation of weights away from eternal, away from general, towards particular and towards unique. And some of that was already implicit in the whole, 19th century German academic distinction between the realm of history and the realm of nature. The realm of history was the place where single events mattered, where single people mattered, where single accomplishments mattered. It wasn't a place to just look for universal laws of history, right? The universal laws of history are the least interesting thing about history. All the interesting things about history are the individual things that happened this way and not that way once. And he's looking for that same in thought and the history of thought, including the future history of thought. I want to get back to this temporality aspect just a second, for just a second. When he talked about the sense of foreboding, he brought up the fact that foreboding is not just focused on the future in time, but affects all aspects of man's temporality. And I want to bring out that because it helps with understanding some of this this changed attitude towards time business. Foreboding is not just what might happen next. It's also the sense that something is happening now that I'm missing. And it's also the sense that something happened 5 exit back when I missed the turn, and that's why I'm in the wrong place now. So the sense of foreboding can affect all of the ecstasies of time, the future, the present, the past. And the same is true of all of these importance ascribed to essential possibilities of action. It's not just the future decision, right, that matters in this orientation. Okay, but those right. So, but again, there's this different focus on the fundamentals of relation to time. Okay, but there's another aspect of this, which is it's not just relation to time; it's relation to truth. So, he talked about how there's a unique goal of history, which is this establishing the seeking itself, which is the seeking after being. And that such seeking occurs as the deep discovery when humans decisively become preservers of the truth of being or stewards of the stillness of listening for the truth of being. So Dasein becoming a seeker, preserver, steward. He says that is what is meant by care as the fundamental trait of Dasein. So he's vastly generalizing what we saw in being in time, where care was something which was pervasive to every human being in even in everyday existence. To here, there's a peak of care. And the peak of care is whether mankind takes upon himself the task of being the preserver, steward, and seeker of the truth of being. So again, this is this reorientation business and this highest business. The stuff that in being in time was all so general that it could be a contribution to philosophical anthropology or a contribution to cognitive science, and that impressed people because of how generally it applied. Right, and how much the structure could be, found in other places, right? He doesn't want that to be the decision criteria. He's not trying to just make a contribution to philosophical anthropology. He's trying to explain where man is now for the sake of a future decision about how he will live, right? So this changed historical importance criteria is essential to him, even as he looks back at being in time, and he thinks lots of people who took it the other way do that just because they live in the first beginning. Dan.
Yeah, going that's related to this, like in being in time, like everything it seems like bottom in the temporality and the ecstatic aspect of temporality. And that happened kind of, even if it happened there at design level, it was kind of something general. While here, that thing is time is kind of unique and it's much bigger in a way. Like it's kind of shift of emphasis, how time is approached. And probably this connects with location. That's also unique. Kind of time buttons in location somehow as the event or something like that. But it's away from, like, to me now that you are saying this, like time in being in time is more kind of, it's generic, it's general, it's
yes, it's
but
structure. It's
yeah, it's
structures of time. And because it structures in time, it's trying to be generalities about it. And the thing which Heidegger here is trying to get at is that's all very well, but something else happened in the book Being in Time besides the structures of time being explained, which was for the first time the structure Dasein itself was revealed to man. Jason?
Yeah, doesn't this sound like it's a bit structured like Nietzsche in a way in his challenges for humanity? It does have that kind of ring to it.
So I think that's fair that there's plenty of indebtedness here. I mean, Nietzsche is famous for wanting to invert Platonism, for wanting to change the emphasis from being to becoming, and so on. But Heidegger has pointed out in lots of his works on Nietzsche, the ways in which Nietzsche doesn't actually follow through on that and kind of remains in a residual Platonism of his own, right? The eternal return of the same is the closest approximation to being that you can have in a world of becoming, as though closely approximating eternity is the most important thing about things which otherwise transpire in time. And Heidegger looks at that in Nietzsche and sees he's trying to live up to a standard set by Plato that he thinks he's overturned, but he's not freed himself from. If you actually cared about the overturning of the standard of only the eternal is important, you would see value in the unique, in the historical, in what happens only once. And it wouldn't matter to you a lick whether or not the thing happened an infinite number of times in all eternity. What matters to you is what it does in the one time traversal you live, the one finite time traversal you live. So in a way, Heidegger is trying to be more systematic in carrying out some of those criticisms of the tradition that were already there in Nietzsche, but that Heidegger thinks Nietzsche did not actually stick with. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Great. Dan?
Yeah, a few more things. Like he's also, it's kind of like, as opposed to being in time, he's moving away from structure, even if we have that kind of loose structure there with 6 steps, and then he's explicitly attacking system here, and it's this move away from structure system to the unique. And it's again like it's striking, like in modern sciences like this, they use this metaphysics, they cannot handle the unique, and they also postulate this multiverse, like, and in order to make sense of the unique, like it's always they need this multiverse structure.
Yes.
It still strikes me that it's kind of, yeah.
The multiverse is a roundabout way of confessing that your theory underspecifies the world, right? Because it allows all these things to happen, but then you just claim that they all do, right? So that you can have something that looks deterministic. The reality is your theory underspecifies what happens. Something happens, your theory doesn't say which, so you put together an ensemble instead. But we can get to this, to the criticism of systematic thinking here. I want, maybe we should just jump to that. I wanted to get some things about the modern world and what shocks me about it, but let's start with the criticism of the structural. What's the point? It's not even really a criticism. He makes the point that the older style of thinking, which was systematic thinking, compelled the reader along by what was logically entailed by the earlier steps as just as enunciated in the language. So language itself has logical entailments which make the other steps go. And that means what it engages in the reader is he brings his own logical machine that he's trained to think in a mathematical manner. And he can see the words, and he can see the things that follow from the words. And he has a sense of the next things following almost effortlessly, but really from the application of his logic machine from the previous. And whenever that's happening, he feels like he is on solid ground. He feels like this is necessary. He feels like he is following. And Heidegger calls all of that a reassuring of him. It's like you're reassuring him that he's on explored territory. But now notice, from a purely Popperian point of view, that means no new information is being added in the subsequent steps. Nothing new is being decided. Nothing new is being seen. Everything was entailed there in the premises. Conceptual thinking, as Heidegger is explaining it, is instead looking away from the words towards the things the words are describing, and it's asking the reader to experience those himself and to verify the next thing as an observation himself. So it's as though you are reporting things in the lab, not as though you were reporting things in a mathematical deduction, right? Separate observational experiences. Now I see this, now I see this, now I see this. There's no need for them to be logically entailed by one another. What there is a need for the descriptions to match the thing observable and for the other person to recapitulate the observation themselves. So conceptual thinking appeals to intellectual intuition by directly looking at the thing, and it uses description by just trying to be continually regrounded, whereby regrounded we mean regrounded in the actual happening. We would say in the observation, but in the actual happening, the experience, right? So the grounding is not back through mathematical machinery to the premises. The grounding is to experienced actuality, and it recurs at each subsequent step. It's observational in that sense. That's how it wants to reason. So when you were talking about how you try to say the thing that you see, Dan, you were describing that as what this is trying to be about. That's the actual method. The method is not logical entailment. That's why when you mentioned the analytical philosopher couldn't find anything to grab onto, and he was, because it's not acting by, if you grant me these premises, I can force these things to follow. There's no forcing in it. It's only invitation. But the invitation is to look at the same thing I'm looking at. And that's why it is a questioning sketching of, can you see this too? Can you see this too? Right, Dan?
Yeah, and this is kind of like a phenomenological experience, not an an observation or like an experimental observation, which is highly mathematical by its, like, according to Heidegger.
Honestly, the lab observation is not as mathematical as Heidegger may think it is, but yes, it is phenomenological experience, re-experiencing it oneself, that he is appealing to here, not lab book work in the physics lab. Sure. What they both have in common, though, is they are appealing to a grounding in being that is an experienceable actuality, not that is a logical entailment from some previous premise, right? The Aristotelian wants the flow of necessary reasoning from a few premises to take him to truths he hadn't understood before, but which were entailed by it, right? The Heideggerian conceptual thinker wants to, for all the things that he is thinking or intimating about it, he wants to be able to re-experience them himself, right? And that's what counts as seeing it, is the ability to re-experience it oneself. We talked a little bit about that in what is called thinking, about how the words are meant to be spells that can evoke the experience, so the person can rehab that experience themselves and bring it into their memory, right? That notion of the telling word as being a way of re-evoking an experience, which is also there in poetry, right? Is why it has that poetic feel of evocative language. Okay. But anyway, I wanted to get on that on the systematic, and obviously that systematic method is not just a method. It's meant to attach to the kinds of generalized truths that the Platonic understanding cared about. It's meant to attach to structures that have eternal verity, that have necessity to them. Whereas a grounding in an episodic observation is trying to reground itself in an experienced happening, because it's experiencing actuality as where being speaks to man, right? It's not the eternal where being speaks to man, it's the actual where being speaks to man. That's the conceptual thinking move, if that makes sense.
Okay, can I say one more thing?
Please.
So with structure and with general, there is also, I think, a loose meaning that I think Heidegger also intends, is like when we explain something that is new by linking it to something that we already know, that's kind of we bring it into structure. Well, something unique, we cannot link it with anything that we already have. It's kind of like it's outside that. It stands on itself, and it's developed by itself, and it cannot be brought or reduced to anything else.
And this is the notion of the open or questioning that he keeps emphasizing, of being an unexplored territory, right? So the unique happening, the unexplored territory, the open to the new, the touching actuality again, the immediate revelation, right? All of those things are correlate terms for Heidegger, and what they are contrasted with is the safety of explored territory where everything is reliably following your expectations, right? But from Heidegger's point of view, what makes philosophy the open questioning that it is that it thinks exposedly into the unknown, right? It scouts. So, and I think that's fair. That's true of the older philosophy too. That's true of Plato and Aristotle at their best. They're scouting into what was to them unknown. It may seem entirely settled territory to us because we're raised on 2,000 years of traditions of teaching Aristotelian logic. But when he was discovering Aristotelian logic for the first time, it was unknown territory to him. And that's why there's this hearkening back to the first beginning as a beginning. Okay. I want to come back to some of the elements of the basic disposition, because I sketched it out when I was trying to explain the general transition, but there's some more details on the basic disposition stuff. There's some things he says there when he talks about wonder versus foreboding, right? Wonder is something which there's a whole book on it over there of wonder as the basic experience of the first beginning, but here he calls it foreboding. I want to put that in terms that might help some people with traditional understanding. The fear of abandonment by being is the beginning of wisdom, is the idea of that foreboding, right? That's my own formulation of it. But there's a fear of that is a beginning of wisdom in the conceptual disposition, and that fear of it, that sense of uncanny, is a fear of abandonment by being. Okay. We already mentioned that about being is not on speaking terms with modern man. Okay. So this idea that a basic disposition is a source of revealing of truth about being was already there in Being in Time. If I don't know if people remember back to this, but this was especially when he brought up sense of angst, right? Which was meant to be fundamental to understanding the structure of care, right? That someone could feel anxiety towards existence itself was a sign that care was part of the fundamental structure of Dasein. Why does that matter? It matters because there's a sense of trusting the capability to have the feeling as something which is a source of truth. If I'm programmed to think X, I'm going to put this all in modern technological terms, please pardon me. If I'm programmed to feel X in a certain situation, it's probably there for a reason. There's something about my actual situation that is being unveiled or revealed by that. And the same is true here for the detection of absence of meaning, or the detections of absence of a sense of being. Heidegger says in passing that at first what happens is just that the word being starts losing its meaning and seems to become more meaningless and seems to become more ungrounded. And then it's that meaning becomes unnecessary and disappears. And the idea is that the tracking of those changes, of the declining meaningness of the philosophical word, is already telling you something about the attunement of the underlying people. Underlying people are losing their attunement to that sense of a truth independent of their purposes and their will, which was there in that word and in focus on that word and concern with that word. He mentions that in even the systematic thinking of Fichte and Hegel at their best, there was a sense of that they were still after something like that connection to truth of being. They were trying to find something general, yes, but they were trying to keep that connection to a unified transcendent truth. And that is, progressively evaporated since, if that makes sense. Anyway, the point is that to trust the intuitions one has about those things is part of this sense of foreboding and sense of restraint that he's describing as the fundamental attunement of the other beginning, right? And I think that Dan is right that if you don't have that sense, it's hard to understand what he's getting at here. I think that it's not that hard if you look for it to get something of that sense. Okay. I want to talk about the stuff he says about ideology in passing, but before we move on to not ideology, worldview. Before we move on to worldview, are there other thoughts on what I just went over with the attunement and mood? Questions about that, Dan?
I think it's interesting that like Wittgenstein in his later period, he said something like the world of a sad man or something like that. It's completely different from a world of a, so we see different things. We different truths almost. It's not just like what shows to different humans, it's completely different worlds. And I was finding it interesting that someone like Wittgenstein in the end admitted to something like that.
Yeah, you also called Kierkegaard the deepest thinker of the 19th century, right? So he definitely had those tendencies in other respects as well. Yeah, but Heidegger is not really content with all these things to be private. He doesn't want these things to be just separated worlds of separated experiences. He brings up the common as it was understood in the Greeks several times in our section, and it's the common is first used as a term of philosophical art in Heraclitus, where it means the world that all men share, as opposed to their private opinions, which are their worlds apart. And it is also where the logos happens. It's where truth happens. When Heidegger says that Dasein is always already living in the truth, right? That's meant to be that common again. And Heidegger is not content for these intimations of how being is revealed to man to be private possessions of a few individuals, including himself, as though the people that don't see or feel them are just in their Pythagoreanly separate, but equal private worlds. Nothing like it. There's a difference of rank and a difference of height in having these experiences versus not having these experiences, in being able to see these things versus not being able to see these things, from Heidegger's point of view. And that's connected to the notion that this connection to being as a calling on man is not something that is idiosyncratic to a few people, right? It's not like, some people have the idiosyncrasy that they care about being. Other people like race cars. No, right? But it is important to track how this notion of common shifts. When he's criticizing the Greeks, he often mentions this common as being the common across the beings that he imagines the concept or idea extracts out of them. And that's certainly one sense of idea in Plato. But the earlier sense of common was the one truth that is the between, that the separate worlds of separate minds all share. And I think that attachment is still definitely there in Plato. Plato thinks of the problem of the individual in its instances on the paradigm of the problem of the appearances and the one truth. That is, he uses the subjective versus true relationship as his model for how to understand the supervening of an idea over its instances, not the other way around. Right.
And I think it's interesting, there is this concept of destiny. Like I think the Greeks used to have it, and then the Germans, they talk a lot about it, and it seems like it's somewhere in between. It's not something general, but it's also not something personal, but it's something like you as an individual, you get in tune with something, like usually it was God, or with something like a big story of the world, and individual find themselves in tune with this. And they I think, to me, that destiny was something that goes into this, that is not subjective, but also not general.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing to think of here for this history connection side of it, though, is just the whole world of religion, revelation, Israel, right, as opposed to Greeks and nature, right? The sacred history is the one history in which things matter for the one way they happened, and that is suffused with destiny, and it's about the direct relation of individuals to being, to whom the truths of being are revealed, something like that. There is already a model of it being history, which is freighted with the meaning, not nature, which is freighted with the meaning, outside of the Greeks, but within the tradition, right? The whole Jerusalem side of the tradition is about that understanding of history, not the Greek understanding of history. And I think that there's no question that that's also involved here, right? The focus on the history side of this is something which Heidegger didn't invent. It's already there in German idealism. And it's there in German idealism because trying to put together anything like Jerusalem and anything like Athens in the same tradition leads to needing the history term, right? That's already there in Hegel. It's already there in Fichte, right? So how much has Heidegger gone outside of that? I don't know, right? We'll have to go through the whole book to see. He thinks that some of it is unique. He thinks that some of it is certainly farther in the direction of appreciating the truth of history as unique than he sees in the systematic German idealists, in the Hegels of the world, right?
Yeah. And definitely there is, like, in the technological and modern society, there is no room for destiny. Like, there is no such thing. We are kind of like cogs in a, like, replaceable and similar cogs in a big machine.
Well, I'm going to partly disagree with you because I'll give you an example, right? So Nietzsche says the 20th century will be the age of the struggle for dominion over the earth fought between fundamental philosophical ideas. And he sees that as a destiny in the 1870s and 1880s, right? And he can do that because he just sees how these forces he understands operating the world are operating now and will operate. So does that mean that all of that is a calculable power configuration? Yes, in a sense. Does he also think of that as a destiny? Yes, he does. Does he think of what he himself is doing as a destiny, and that he is, making mankind conscious of his situation for the first time in a way that is meant to recapitulate Hegel's moment of the insight of absolute spirit? Absolutely, right? So there are these motifs in German idealism that have culminating moments in history in them that see destiny in that is there in Nietzsche too, right? And to the extent that Nietzsche and technology can be, one is the inside view of the world described the other way from the outside, right? I think that there is destiny in a technological world, right? It's just a romantic interior subjective view of a technological world and one's role in the pageant of history within it or something like that. It may look pretty thin and reedy to us from the outside, but it's only because we don't share it. But anyway, the point that I'm making is that some of these moments of there is a single moment of philosophical insight in which the transition from the old way of thinking to the new way of thinking is finally realized, and this is the culminating moment of, or the most important moment in world history. Heidegger's notion of the previous beginning and another beginning is not the first instance of that in German idealism. It's maybe the 12th, right? It's a recurring theme in German idealism. They all have a room for that moment in their structure because of the things that they're synthesizing. Okay. Okay. The meaning of philosophy. There's a whole section where he goes through what philosophy means. Did anyone focus on this or notice this? This is, oh, yeah, okay. Just mentioning other things in my notes that I have to talk about, but the meaning of philosophy, he talks about how philosophy as grounding and open is useless sovereign knowledge, right? So it has to be useless because if we're useful, it would be calculated, and if we're calculated, it wouldn't be open, and truth wouldn't change it. Its purpose would, right? So he's contrasting the useless with the open, right? Open experiments, you don't know what you want to see, right? You're expecting to be surprised. Philosophy has to be like that, is the claim. And he's going to contrast this with worldviews. Worldviews end by being total. And what do I mean by total? By total, they because they seek to explain everything, they do not leave a room for the creative and the new. They don't want a sovereign power outside of themselves, uncontrolled by themselves, under themselves. And his analysis of worldviews is pretty much an analysis of modern ideologies and the power configurations based upon them. And it's meant to also be his diagnosis / explanation of what passes for thought in a technological age, something like that. And passes for thought, there's also science going on, right? There's, maybe the sort of thinking he's engaged in going on. There's also, as he puts it in passing, philosophy is a cultural artifact. What does he mean by that? He means that people who have philosophy departments, the way they have cathedrals that nobody who enters and believes in anymore as tourist attractions, right? So you have a philosophy department so you can show off that Oxford is still important in this or something like that. The same way you show off a pretty cathedral. So, but the point is he's very deprecating about all these ways in which thought other than the kind of philosophy he's talking about is seen or experienced in the modern age. And the one of them that is serious is serious is not quite the right word. The one that is dangerous to the point of it doesn't really tolerate philosophy and would stamp it out if it could, right? Is the totalizing of worldviews. Because they don't have the openness to questioning and to being unsettled that philosophy necessarily requires. If you like, philosophy is always too revolutionary for any totalitarian worldview to be happy with. And I do read that as part of his, agon with the regime in his time, right? There are elements of nationalism, as Pete was saying, which are, ways in which his own thought is definitely being infected and affected by the stuff going on around him. And the same is certainly true with his reactions to Nietzsche. But there is also just an agon with from his point of view, the modern world, not just the regime, but we can see that it's also the regime, the totalizing regime around him. Anyway, that's all there in the worldview discussion. Are there other? I know that Joe, you had questions about the worldview part of it, and you wanted to see what that might have come from, or it was new to you to think about these things as worldviews.
We worked through that pretty well. Thank you very much. But I'm glad you're getting back to it because I can see that part of his obvious opposition to the worldview believers has to do with the worldview around which he's being bombarded almost every day, I'm sure, in those years.
It does, but it's notable that in the sections we read, he's also critical in passing of communism, liberalism, and even Christianity if made into a total worldview, right?
I was amused by seeing Bolshevism identified as a version of Christianity. That struck me as true, absolutely correct, given the messianic stuff and the.
Yes.
I mean, it seems funny.
So it is useful to understand that in the context of the sort of stuff at his time. And in his time, right, in a way, he's pointing out an incoherence in the Nietzscheanism of the regime, but it's really an incoherence between that Nietzscheanism and the overlay of the more traditional political divisions at the time. The traditional political divisions at the time was the communists were all on one side and the Christians were all on another, right? And the big struggle / pole in the world was between Germany and Russia, which was communist and atheist, right? And so from that point of view, the Bolshevism is considered alien to Christianity, but then Bolshevism he points out is Western. It's not remotely an Eastern thing. It came out of Germany, right? It's definitely a product of the West and not the other way around. And then, so does that mean that it's not Jewishness? Well, it means that it's actually coming from the West, which is coming from Christianity. But then Nietzsche is also saying Christianity is coming from Judaism. So Bolshevism is only Jewish because Christianity is. So that you have, and that equation only works because Bolshevism is Christian, right? So the point is that all three of them wind up just getting equal signs put between them, and this is completely meaningless for the purpose of contemporary political division causing and strife and war, right? Which is what all of these things are actually about and used for. But this is mostly just pointing out the incoherence of it, right? There's obviously no true meaningful sense in which Bolshevism is Jewish as opposed to being a product of the left Hegelians of the 19th century and Marx, right? It obviously is, right? It was created in Germany, right? And it's a modern, Western European ideology. But anyway, the point is, those were the kinds of things that were current in Germany at the time, and were given some semblance of importance by being tied back to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's ideas about the history of morality or something in his less sane moments. Dan?
Yeah, I think it's interesting maybe to mention that one of his first articles, like when he was young, was against, like, he criticized Jasper's, like the worldview, like the worldview book, and then that's how they become friends, and Jasper was impressed with him. And I think, and probably like even today, like looking around, like we have what's called a scientific worldview, like they try to put everything together in the coherent and self-contained, like you have this kind of, like, I don't know, popular scientific worldview, or it's materialistic and so on. You I don't know, you read Dennett or Hawkins, and they create this kind of thing. They cut corners, they make it coherent, they make it self-sustaining, and it's, as it says here, it closes itself from not to question its ground, and not questions are not allowed. You are dismissed, like this says that this question doesn't make sense, so it's not a question. You are talking about something that doesn't exist. So they define what exists, and again they cut their loose ends, and they create a something that is self-sustaining, and it's closed,
Right.
and it's, yeah.
So I mean, and we can all understand, I guess. I mean, that these worldview ideologies take the form that they do for the sake of competition for adherence with one another, right? So they form themselves around arguments which are useful for splitting away some portion of adherence from some other formation and getting them into their own. And they similarly try to immunize themselves against arguments that they've encountered before from the others in order to maintain their people on side, etc. Right? All of that, is clearly going on in them, and each of them has, some element of or elements of truth that it ties itself to, and tries to be a truth interpreting formation for those within it. The point that you get from the Nietzschean understanding of these things, though, is that this is akin to how Nietzsche understands the different historical moralities that you get described in, like, 1,000 Goals in One and Zarathustra, right? Of different moral teachings, different values, and people like Weber understood these different worldviews as clashing values at bottom. Right? At bottom, it's, which comes first, this attachment or that attachment, and depending on which one you put highest and which values you put highest, you arrive at one set of conclusions or another set of conclusions which are incompatible with one another. And the question to someone like Weber was, can reason decide between them? Right? And his attitude after being trained by Nietzsche in value thinking was, no, these are just fundamentally incompatible value worlds that are at bottom incompatible with one another and kind of at war with one another. And you can decide around the edges on this or that case how to improve one or the other, take into account criticisms that come from another worldview. But at bottom, they're just incompatible views of the world with incompatible fundamental moral or value premises. Now, Nietzschean thinking would then add that those fundamental moral things are the projections of the needs of the instigators of those positions and of their adherents. They are calcified interest. They are the life interests of the kind of people that live inside those ideologies. And that means that the ideologies have to be thought of as rival power formations within life. Different life drives that are pre-rational or sub-rational project the Marxian term is superstructure of an ideology that encapsulates those interests, right? And the Marxians and the Nietzscheans would agree on that there's some fundament of interest, whether of class or of type of life or whatever psychological needs, that get bound up in that superstructure, and those superstructures then clash. But they clash because they are not competing as truths on the plane of truth with evidence and reason deciding between them. They're clashing at the level of interest with adherence and passion behind them. They are motivated structures. And because of that, the strife between them is conflict. It's not discovery. It's not truthfulness. And Heidegger is reacting to all that when he says that because of that, philosophy cannot engage on that terrain. Philosophy, to remain philosophy, because it has to remain open, cannot turn itself into just strife. And he says it has to retreat to the ground of the experiences on which it is founded, of these experiences of happening in the truth of being. He mentions in passing that if you created a polemics as a defense of philosophy, would risk, falling below the rank of philosophy, etc. So he is worried that not only is philosophy endangered by the ideological worldview thinking, but that if it even erected a similar structure to defend itself from them, it would just get dragged into the pit with them, so to speak. Right. So there is a definite downplaying of the plane of political strife, political opinion, as anything that can be engaged with philosophically here. And in contrast to that, philosophy always has to be open, questioning, and not think it already has all the answers. The characteristic mark of the totalizing ideologies is they are not open to truth because they think they have all the answers. They will never let themselves discover something that would upset their fundament.
And maybe this
they're
is
not dedicated to truth. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
this is maybe the reason why Heidegger decided not to publish this book, because he refused to have a, like, he saw what happened with Being and Time when he was trying to be engaged and dragged down at the level of that kind of conversation. I thought that philosophy should not be stay there, but stay in a different plane, and maybe decided not to publish this book.
It's possible, but I mean, he published other things, before. Yeah, I mean, I think that not publishing is in part because it's so far off in his own direction on this thinking. He did not expect it to be understood. He felt even that Being in Time had been misunderstood in essential ways, including by people who took it as being akin to Jasper's and so on. There's a lot of evidence of that sprinkled about, even just the part we read. But yeah, I don't think that reaction stuff is essential. But this stuff not being published, I think, is he doesn't think that the outer world was ready to follow him in these lines of thought, something like that. Okay. So we talked a little about what's special about conceptual thinking, besides the part about the different focus on time. The other thing to realize about this conceptual thinking is it's got a lot of the notes that we already saw in Being in Time about call, about questioning we just talked about, the things which we see in the later what is called Thinking book about the preserving thankful memory, all this kind of stuff. All of that is in a way already there. There's already this notion of thought as a spiritual calling, something like that, that's there in this conceptual thinking that is designed to be focused on the truth of being, something like that. But I think we understand that. We'll get to more about conceptual thinking as we go on, but we can already understand that as the attempt to have a grounding for thinking in its in something like a standard of truth outside of human interests or outside of the proclivities of the individual person engaged with it, that can cause a seriousness of reattachment to the calling, right, to intellectual calling, akin to what the Greeks had in the discovery of nature, something like that. Right, that's where there is a parallel or even a model in the first beginning. The degree of reorientation you can have from that at a societal scale is the model here, and I think that also talks to some of the things about when people's talking about, we're past peak nationalism, but there's still some nationalism there. There's a notion you get here that something like the modern Germans, because they had created German idealism, are the only place where thoughts like this can happen. So thoughts like this can only come out of the German idealist tradition, right? You're not going to find thoughts like this in Japan. You're not going to find thoughts like this in, France, right? Maybe a little bit in France after the postmodernists, but you get the point. There's tradition prerequisites for anything like this being understood, and the prerequisite here is the foundation in the whole tradition of German idealism from Kant to Nietzsche, right? And because that's necessary for this to be understood, there's a sense in which if this thought is to come, it's going to come from German thinkers or thinkers influenced by the Germans. Is that just nationalism? In the 30s, maybe. Now, with the amount that this is disseminated and has influenced other continental traditions, maybe it's continental philosophy and its offshoots in the English-speaking world. Who knows? But there is a requirement of continuity with that German idealist tradition as well as with the Greek tradition for anything like this thought to be understood, right? There's sections in there where we ask the questions: who are we, right? We say we have this task, right? Who is that we? Is that we just Heidegger? Is it just a hopeful, addition of that maybe there'll be some other people who pay attention to me besides me, and it really just means, Martin? Or is there a we that's actually there that can follow this thought? That we is not simply the German people in the 1930s. It's not a political movement.
Nietzsche does that too. Nietzsche will say the we, the we moderns, so it's a little bit like that.
Yes, you're absolutely right that Nietzsche does the same thing. Nietzsche also will say in some of his more autobiographical books that he, in his younger days, says we all the time as though he had a giant set of people behind him, when in fact, there were only 6 people in the world who read his books, right? So there was a little bit of he's self-deprecating about that. There's he talked about I think it was one of the later things where he says he talked about the we free spirits, right, in some of his books, and like human all too human, etc. And he'll say in things which are post Beyond Good and Evil that actually those free spirits weren't there yet. It was basically him and maybe a few other people, but as a formation they weren't there yet. There weren't any we free spirits yet. It was aspirational rather than. But yes, the point is some of these we's are meant to be representative of schools of thoughts that are so inchoate that they haven't even formed yet, right? He certainly is not trying to speak for the Western philosophical tradition as though everyone in it agrees with him. But it is useful to note that question is there and that it is a question he is asking himself. If something like another beginning like this could happen, right? What can bring that about? It's not the kind of thing that he thinks he can bring about on his own, right? So anyway, I invite continued reflection on the who is the we. Dan?
Yeah, I think going back to this we, and I think I mentioned it's the few. I think Heidegger mentioned in some places like he liked to look at I think the quantum mechanics revolution. He said that it's just a handful of people who understand it, and that's all you need to start a revolution, like a few determined people who are into this thing, and then from them the rest will follow. And I think he saw his revolution along these lines also. It's not a popular revolution, but a handful of people who get into this and they take the leap and so on.
So I think that's largely right. I mean, I think that he shares with others in the German idealist tradition and with Nietzsche the idea that that sort of peaks of elite thought create their own followers, create their own movement behind them, something like that. But I also think that he is here's the curious thing, right? He's very much focused on the historical happening and historical importance of some of these changes, but he also is very down on the calculated machination aspect of charting courses of future history, right? Strategically, right? He's not trying to create a revolution in the sense that he is organizing in a garret with 6 other people with revolvers who are going to, take over the world in 50 years, right? It's not that kind of thing at all. It's all aspirational, invitational, and here is a duty that it would be a high dignity of man to fulfill, something like that. But the rhetoric is all of invitation. It's also, yes, as you say, exclusive. It's a you would be among the chosen few if you could do this, something like that, right? There's as a rhetorical appeal, but it's not a plan unfolding, right? Of here are the stages and here are the steps to be taken and here is the result to be affected by it. It's sketched. It is a questioning sketch of a possible transition, something like that. And that preliminary character, I think, is essential to it. It's how this is not Hegel, right? This is not a completed system a la Hegel that is, going to create a structure that people can understand and live in as a happy completed habitation. It's an outline. Okay. I've gotten to the end of the stuff I want to make sure I covered in an exposition. So I'm ready for if people have questions about particular passages or other things we didn't manage to touch upon. You don't have to have them, but if you do. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Pete.
So I'd like to get back to this next beginning. And he's saying that, we have to wait in stillness. We can't willfully do anything. We have to open ourselves up and listen for this call. And at some point, some poet will get it, express it, and then we'll go, oh, yeah, that's it. We've all been feeling discombobulated, uncanny, but now there's a new meaning that we can accept, and this is the new beginning. And what strikes me is this seems very similar to Christian eschatology, that we had the first beginning 2,000 years ago, and he said, I'm going to come back and there's going to be the kingdom of God. And the Christians have been waiting for this. They can pray. There's nothing they can do to bring the kingdom of God any closer, apparently. And he's saying this is what will happen in the future. There's nothing we can do to bring it about apart from being very still so we can hear it when being speaks to us, calls to us. But is there any, thing for us to do besides wait for this event?
So it's fair, but to ask, but absolutely yes, right? There obviously is, and so absolutely yes. So first of all, to understand the first beginning and the tradition with this in the light of this possibility, and in the light of the transformations that's occurred, right? Which is partly recapitulation of some of his own philosophical activity, but it's also a deepening understanding of that first beginning and a recapitulation of the moments of meaning creation that occurred within it. What do I mean by that? If you look back at some of the things that were done in the tradition and you only look at them from the standpoint of what eternal truths did they discover that we can lay up in the heavens, and how did they pave the way for Hegel to make a system at the end of it, right? Then you have a very different assessment of what their importance was and what their achievements were, and how they arrived at them, and what experiences might be behind it, or what reasoning might be behind it, than if you think of them as having themselves been still thinkers listening to the voice of being themselves, who heard intimations of it in this or that they were doing, and where you can find the traces of that incorporated into their discoveries. You can find that incorporated into their sense of wonder. You can find that incorporated into their into how what poetic image or experience of arising, appearing was behind the Greek translation of the word phusis, things like that, right? So a lot of that is stuff you already see in his other activity. Beyond that, there's the model of what he's doing here, of sketching out the elements of the transition, of sketching out what it would entail, of understanding what anything like this changed appreciation of the momentary, of changed appreciation of the unique, what it does to not only past thought that brought us here, but to present thought, and to thinking on present philosophical questions. So the stillness of contemplation in which something speaks to a thinker doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because he is steeped in the tradition and steeped in the problems the new way of thinking, and only then, right? It's yes, it's thoughts that come in a still hour, but the thoughts that come in a still hour will not come to you if you're not engaged deeply, completely with them as thoughts for extended periods of time, right? And in this open, engaged way. Similarly, on the plane of poets and art, etc., the way in which that proceeds is to begin with from this sense of what's missing, from this sense of uncanny, from this sense of out of joint, from paying attention to and trusting that and trying to articulate it, right? The experiential and mood bases of anything like the transition are already present in the current situation. And if people think those, feel those in an attuned way and can find ways to express them in art and beings and in things they can communicate with each other in sayings, then that's what spreads that sense. That's what spreads that appreciation. That is the preparation for leap, if you want to put it that way, right? So none of this happens just in quietude, but it is certainly the case that the peak insights happen in quietude, right? You find this even in Nietzsche, in Das Buch Zarathustra, right? He'll write a little aphorism called the stillest hour, and where he's talking about dreams he has of the stillest hour speaking to him and telling him the things he must teach, right? That is this thinker's experience of something like moments of insight in stillness that Heidegger is referring to. But the fact that that's how those peak or culminating insights happen doesn't mean that all the activity before then is sitting in stillness. It is not, right? There is much activity that is preparation for it, which is, the questioning, thoughtful, honest meditation on all of these things. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, it's not an answer, but it opens up
it's a whole
my question a bit more.
It's a whole activity. It's a whole and it's a whole understanding of where one is. But Isabel, I'm sorry. I want to give Isabel a chance to jump in. She may have something to say on this.
Yes. Many kudos to St. Paul, because one lives fully and wholesomely in the first beginning's light. One lives fully, does not reject it. We live here. But there's Perugia. We await, we are alert, we look forward to, in St. Paul's case, the second coming of Christ. In Heidegger's case, the other beginning. Thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, and I think my pushback is, if Heidegger, with an IQ of 185, and he's read all the Greeks, he's read all of the German idealists, and he goes to his cabin and waits in the stillness of winter for being to speak to him, and nothing happens, I kind of despair it might be centuries before somebody's ready to hear the call.
It may very well be centuries, but I put it to you that it is not true that nothing happened. But go ahead. You have a website and an itinerary to testify that something happened. Dan?
Yeah, it's related to this what Pete and Isabel said. It's also like, and it's here. I wanted to point this. It's not just St. Paul, but it's St. Augustine. Is like I've become a question to myself, and I think that's one of the things that Heidegger is going here. Like, what's self, what's conscience, and he said we need to work on that. How to understand this second coming cannot happen as long as we understand the self as present at hand, and we need to define human nature in clear ways, and we need to go back and let this it's a happening, and we need to struggle, and to, again, it goes back to St. Augustine. I've become a question to myself, and it's Christ is not coming if you just stay and wait. You need to make a question of yourself and know who you are and struggle, and then something may happen.
So I'm gonna partly agree. I don't think that the thing for which Heidegger is awaiting is a second coming, but leave that aside. I want to get to the point that Dan was raising about self, because this is another thing he does bring up here. And I don't know if other people detect this, but I see in some of the references to self here ways in which Heidegger's thought in this part we read is indebted to Kierkegaard specifically. For Kierkegaard, self is some little synthesis of the finite and the infinite that is grounded transparently in the power that established it, is the formula, right? So what does that mean? It means that there has a self is grounded in being, or it is not yet a self, right? That's the notion that's being appealed to here. So the Dasein has a meaning which is oscillating here between its use here and its use in being in time. And I think that that's partly what his Da with the apostrophe is for. And I don't think it's just about emphasizing the there-ness of the place as being greater than the individual. It's also Dasein as a mode of existence which is a not yet attained, as opposed to an always already, right? There's a Dasein that every human being always already is, even in their everyday self, so to speak. And there's a Dasein which is a attainment and a unique and a future that is a possible. And the aspirational Dasein is that is a self in the sense of grounded transparently in being, is an existence that is fully responding to the call, that is fully responding to a sense of duty or responsibility to be the place or site where being reveals itself to man. And that being reveals itself to man is not something that is going to be a unique insight that you only heard in the Black Forest on a snowy Tuesday, right? It is testifying to what you see all the time, even when you don't see as much, even if you only see this far, right? It's a that's why it's a it has this notion of the withstanding, right? Because some of the things that you see in being are not very nice, and you have to withstand them. They're not. It's not a pleasant revelation, so to speak. But you can be truthful about what it is that is happening, right? That's the element of the calling in that. The point that I'm making is that Dasein has this aspirational sense. It has this ideal sense of what existence ought to be, like and fulfilling of a calling, and that is the present activity that Heidegger is urging people toward, right? So that is not a doing nothing. It is certainly the case that it is not a technological accomplishment of a 12-step plan that will result in the new beginning flourishing and creating the new Atlantis, right? It is divorced from that planning, technological, manipulative, controlling of the future understanding of history that we get from a lot of the later moderns, and certainly from the earlier German idealists. I think of the Hegel and his descendants, right? It is comparatively quietist in that sense, but it is a duty quietism. It is a what I mean by that is that it has its sense of fulfillment in the proper answering of the call to the extent you have the power to do so, and it doesn't expect accomplishment more than that. It doesn't depend upon accomplishment more than that. It doesn't have to change the world. It has to see and experience the world as it actually is. Does that help? It's always hard to testify out these things because it's partly what one sees in them oneself. Isabel?
Yes, I would just like to point out that I don't think we have to talk about two Daseins, the being and time Dasein and the Dasein that is given to us here in our textbook. It is one Dasein. However, it is, shall we say, a fulfillment or a reassessment of the Dasein that was given to us in Being and Time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that it is. I think that it still is a bit of a change. I mean, he's moving away from the emphasis on the universal in the first beginning sense, on the every human being sense that is definitely still there in Being and Time. You're right that he does want there to be continuity in it. He does want it to be the same structure that he's referring to, but let's put it this way. We've moved far beyond being concerned with the everyday self here. There's a peak concern, there's a peak calling concern that wasn't there. Well, it's not that it wasn't there in Being in Time. It was referred to in Being in Times in some of the discussion of call and conscience, etc. But it was not the main emphasis of Being in Time. The universality of it was in part to get a reception for it, I would say. But anyway, that's just assessments of Being in Time. It's not assessments of our book here. All right, this was all great. I want to give people a chance for last comments before we wrap. We're reading again just the remainder of part 1. For next time, it's about 35 pages, and January 14th, unless we have to move it a week, depending on sort of Pete's availability, I'll make a decision. If we have multiple people that can't make it, or if Pete can make most of it but not 1 hour or something, we might leave it there. But I'll let you guys know as I put things up on the website. So just do pay attention for it possibly moving a week. If it does move a week, it's more likely to move later than earlier. I don't want to give people less time than they're expecting. But right now we'll plan it for the 14th. All right. Well, thanks especially to all the newcomers, and hope this is up to your expectations. And thanks for your contributions. And hope to see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.